Hi everyone, welcome. I hope you're all doing well. Tonight we're going to do something a little different. We're going to walk through the complete mythology of one of the most disturbing fictional characters ever created for television. Every secret, every kill, every betrayal, and every consequence. From the very beginning to the very end. We're talking about Dexter Morgan. And if you're the kind of person who likes to drift off to a calm, thorough deep dive into dark subject matter, then you're in exactly the right place. This is going to be a long one, so settle in, get comfortable, and we'll take our time walking through every layer of this story. Before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. To understand Dexter Morgan, you have to start with something that happened before he could even form memories. You have to go back to a shipping yard in Miami on October 2nd, 1973. Because everything that Dexter would eventually become, every kill, every ritual, every quiet night spent wrapping a room in plastic sheeting, all of it traces back to a single cargo container and what happened inside it on that day. Dexter's biological mother was a woman named Laura Moser. Laura was born on June 20th, 1946 in a small town called Bannon in North Carolina. She eventually ended up in Miami, where she became involved with a man named Joe Driscoll. Together they had two sons. The older boy was Brian, and the younger one was Dexter, born on February 1st, 1971. Laura's life in Miami was complicated. She was involved in the drug trade, and somewhere along the way she crossed paths with a Miami homicide detective named Harry Morgan. Harry Morgan wasn't just any detective, he was a respected, established figure within the Miami Metro Police Department. And his relationship with Laura Moser went beyond professional. Harry recruited Laura as a confidential informant. The idea was simple in theory. Laura would feed Harry inside information about the local drug trade, specifically about a kingpin named Hector Estrada and his operation. In exchange, Harry would protect her and keep her out of prison. But the relationship went further than that. Harry and Laura became romantically involved. This affair would have consequences that neither of them could have predicted, consequences that would ripple across decades and destroy multiple lives. Laura's assignment was dangerous from the start. She was embedded in a world of violence and paranoia, where betrayal was punished with death. She attended meetings at shipping yards where she witnessed firsthand what happened to people who crossed the cartel. On one of her final visits, she watched a drug dealer get beaten and have his finger removed after the cartel discovered he'd been stealing from them. Laura saw her own future in that moment. She understood what would happen to her if they found out she was feeding information to the police, and she tried to stop. This is one of the details that the prequel series Dexter: Original Sin made painfully clear when it aired in late 2024. Laura went to Harry and told him she wanted out. She said she was afraid. She said she believed she was going to end up dead. And Harry, who was under pressure to build a case against Estrada, told her she needed to keep going. He said this was the only way she could stay out of jail and remain with her sons. He told her that they needed to catch Estrada in the act and that she was their only way in. Laura listened. She went back, and the cartel found out what she was doing. On October 2nd, 1973, Hector Estrada ordered her execution. His enforcer, a man named Santos Jimenez, carried it out. Laura, along with 3 other people who had betrayed the cartel, was forced at gunpoint into a cargo container at a Miami shipping yard. The container's identification number was CBAN 3489. That number would come back to haunt the franchise decades later, but in that moment, it was just a metal box in a shipping yard. And inside it, something happened that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of multiple human lives. Santos Jimenez brought a chainsaw. While Laura's 2 young sons watched, Jimenez dismembered all 4 victims. Laura was cut apart in front of her children. 3-year-old Dexter and 5-year-old Brian sat in that container and watched their mother die in the most violent way imaginable. And then they were left there. The killers walked away, and the 2 boys stayed in the container for 2 full days. From Tuesday through most of Wednesday, Dexter and Brian sat in pools of their mother's blood, surrounded by body parts, in the dark, in a metal shipping container in the Miami heat. 2 days. When the police finally found them, it was Harry Morgan who arrived first on the scene. He opened the container and found the boys in an appalling state. And here is where the first of many defining choices was made. Harry rescued Dexter. He picked the younger boy up and carried him out. Other officers eventually recovered Brian, but Harry chose Dexter first. He took Dexter home. He and his wife Doris eventually adopted the boy and raised him as their own son. Brian was not adopted. Brian was sent to a mental institution in Tampa Bay. He grew up without a family, without a father figure, without anyone to channel the darkness that the shipping container had planted inside him. This separation of the two brothers is one of the foundational tragedies of the entire Dexter mythology. Both boys experienced the same trauma, both sat in the same blood, both watched the same horror, but one was rescued and given structure, and the other was abandoned to a system that had no idea what had been done to him. Harry's decision to save one brother and leave the other to the state created two entirely different outcomes from the same point of origin. Dexter would become a serial killer who followed a code, a man who killed within rules and maintained a semblance of a normal life. Brian would become the ice truck killer, a serial killer with no code, no boundaries, and no restraint. Same trauma, same blood, two completely different monsters. Harry's guilt over Laura's death shaped everything he did with Dexter from that point forward. He knew he had sent Laura into the shipping yard. He knew his insistence that she keep informing was what got her killed. He knew that by pushing her to stay in the operation, he had indirectly caused the trauma that would define both of her sons for the rest of their lives. That guilt became the fuel for Harry's obsession with managing Dexter. It was not just the concern of an adoptive father. It was the penance of a man who felt responsible for breaking a child and then felt obligated to try to fix what he had broken. What made the shipping yard massacre so devastating was not just the violence itself, but the way it was experienced by the two boys. Dexter was only 3 years old. His conscious memories of the event were buried so deeply that he didn't remember them for decades. When he eventually recovered those memories, it was because his brother Brian, operating under the alias of the ice truck killer, deliberately staged crime scenes designed to trigger Dexter's repressed recollections. Brian left specific clues referencing the date and circumstances of their mother's murder, including the number 103, which corresponded to the October 3rd newspaper article reporting the massacre. He tuned a hotel radio to station 103 FM. He spilled blood in room 103 at the Marina View Hotel. Everything was designed to pull Dexter back to the shipping container, back to the blood, back to the moment that made them both what they were. Brian, being older at the time of the massacre, remembered everything. He never forgot what he saw. He never forgot the sound of the chainsaw. He never forgot sitting in his mother's blood. And he never forgave Harry Morgan for choosing Dexter over him. Brian's entire arc as a villain was driven by abandonment. He was the boy left behind, the boy the system forgot, the boy who was deemed too damaged to save. And in a cruel irony, it was exactly that abandonment that made him too damaged to save. Without a Harry Morgan to channel his darkness, Brian's trauma curdled into something purely destructive. He killed without purpose and without remorse, using the same dismemberment techniques that had been used on his mother, as though he was compelled to repeat the trauma that defined him over and over again. The prequel series added another layer of tragedy to the massacre. It revealed that Deborah Morgan, Harry's biological daughter, was born almost simultaneously with the events surrounding Laura's death. Harry was dealing with a newborn at home, the guilt of sending Laura to die, the complexity of his failing marriage, and the sudden responsibility of adopting a deeply traumatized 3-year-old, all at the same time. Every decision Harry made from that point forward was colored by the impossible weight of these overlapping crises. His adoption of Dexter was not a simple act of kindness. It was an act of guilt, love, obligation, and desperation, all tangled together in ways that Harry himself probably never fully untangled. The shipping container CBAN 3489 would appear again and again throughout the franchise. In Season 1, Dexter searched the container looking for Deborah after Brian kidnapped her, only to find it empty. Brian had actually taken Deborah to their mother's old house, where he recreated elements of the massacre as a final test for Dexter. In Season 7, Dexter himself returned to a shipping container at the same yard, where he lured Hector Estrada and eventually confronted Maria LaGuerta in a scene that ended with Deborah shooting LaGuerta to protect Dexter's secret. The container was the franchise's recurring symbol. It was the original sin, the place where blood was first spilled and where everything that followed was set into motion. What the shipping yard massacre ultimately established was not just Dexter's backstory, but the central question of the entire franchise. If a child is exposed to unspeakable violence at an age when their personality is still forming, is the damage permanent? Can it be managed? Can it be redirected? Or will it always find a way to express itself, no matter what structures are built around it? Harry Morgan believed the damage could be managed. He believed that with the right rules and the right training, Dexter's compulsion to kill could be aimed at people who deserved it. That belief led him to create something that would become both Dexter's salvation and his curse. A set of rules that Harry called the Code. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. What Harry built next would change Dexter's life forever, and it all started with a dead dog buried in the backyard. Harry Morgan was not a stupid man. He was a decorated homicide detective with decades of experience studying criminals, understanding violence, and recognizing patterns of behavior that most people would never notice. So when his adopted son Dexter began exhibiting behaviors that went far beyond normal childhood aggression, Harry did not look away. He did not pretend things were fine. He saw exactly what was happening and understood, with a clarity that must have been absolutely terrifying, what his son was becoming. It started with animals. The family had a dog named Buddy, and one day Buddy went missing. Harry went looking and eventually found a grave in the backyard. He dug it up. Buddy's body was there, but so were other remains. Dexter, who was still a child at the time, offered what seemed like a reasonable explanation. He said the dog's barking was keeping his sick mother Doris awake at night. But the presence of additional animal bones in the grave told Harry something that no parent ever wants to learn about their child. This wasn't a one-time act of frustration. This was a pattern. Dexter was killing animals, and he was doing it with a calm deliberateness that suggested something deeply wrong. For most parents, this would be the moment you call a psychiatrist. You seek professional help. You get your child into therapy, and you hope that early intervention can address whatever is driving this behavior. But Harry didn't do that, and understanding why he didn't is essential to understanding the entire Dexter mythology. Harry carried enormous guilt over what had happened to Dexter's biological mother. He knew that he was partly responsible for the trauma that had broken Dexter. He also knew, from his years working homicide, what happened to people like Dexter when they entered the mental health system or the criminal justice system. They were locked up, medicated, and studied. They were treated as problems to be contained, not people to be helped. Harry didn't want that for the boy he had adopted. He loved Dexter. He felt responsible for him in a way that went beyond normal parental obligation. And so Harry made a decision that was simultaneously an act of love, an act of arrogance, and an act of desperation. He decided to train Dexter himself. What Harry created became known as the Code of Harry. It was a set of rules, a framework for living that was designed to do something that sounds impossible when you say it out loud. The code was meant to allow Dexter to continue killing while minimizing the chances that he would be caught or that he would harm innocent people. Think about that for a moment. A police officer, a man sworn to uphold the law, deliberately taught his adopted son how to be a more effective and more careful serial killer. Not because Harry approved of killing, but because Harry believed, rightly or wrongly, that Dexter's compulsion could not be stopped, only redirected. The code had two fundamental rules. Rule 1 was that Dexter must never be caught. This was the practical foundation. Everything else flowed from it. Dexter had to maintain a normal appearance. He had to hold a job, form relationships, blend in with society, and never draw suspicion. He had to be meticulous about evidence. He had to learn how law enforcement investigated murders so that he could avoid the mistakes that got other killers caught. This is why Dexter eventually became a blood spatter analyst for the Miami Metro Police Department. It wasn't just a convenient cover, it was the logical fulfillment of Harry's first rule. By working inside the system that hunted killers, Dexter gained access to police databases, forensic techniques, and insider knowledge about active investigations. He could monitor threats to his own secrecy and stay one step ahead of anyone who might be getting close. Rule 2 was that Dexter could only kill people who were guilty of murder and who had escaped the justice system. This was the moral foundation, or at least what passed for morality within this deeply unusual framework. Harry understood that he couldn't stop Dexter from killing, but he could determine who Dexter killed. And if Dexter was going to kill regardless, then Harry reasoned it was better for those victims to be murderers who had avoided punishment through corruption, legal technicalities, or simple police failure. In Harry's mind, this transformed Dexter from a random predator into something closer to a vigilante. The code didn't make killing right, it made it less wrong, or at least that was the theory. Harry trained Dexter over the course of years. He taught him about crime scenes, he taught him about evidence, he taught him how to read people, how to fake emotional responses he didn't naturally feel, and how to maintain the appearance of normalcy in social situations. Dexter later reflected that he faked all human interactions and faked them very well. Harry taught him that. Harry also taught him the practical mechanics of killing. How to subdue a target, how to restrain them, how to create a kill room using plastic sheeting so that no biological evidence would be left behind, how to dismember a body and dispose of it in the ocean so that it would never be found. These were not lessons a father should be teaching a son, but Harry believed they were necessary because the alternative was a son who killed randomly and got caught. The code extended beyond just the rules about who to kill and how to avoid detection. Harry also instilled in Dexter a ritual. Before each kill, Dexter was expected to verify his target's guilt. He had to gather proof. He had to be certain. This verification process was Dexter's equivalent of a trial, conducted privately and according to his own standards of evidence. He would research his targets, surveil them, and collect evidence of their crimes. Only after he was satisfied that the target was genuinely guilty would he proceed with the kill. This ritual gave Dexter a sense of order and purpose. It transformed random violence into something that felt deliberate and justified. Whether it actually was justified is one of the questions the show spent 8 seasons and multiple spin-offs trying to answer. Harry also introduced Dexter to the concept of blood slides. After each kill, Dexter would take a small sample of his victim's blood and preserve it on a microscope slide. These slides became Dexter's trophies, kept in a wooden box hidden inside the air conditioning unit of his apartment. They served multiple functions. They were proof that each kill had been conducted according to the code. They were a record of Dexter's work. And they were, on a psychological level, a way for Dexter to maintain a connection to his kills after the act itself was over. The blood slides became one of the most recognizable symbols of the franchise. They also became one of Dexter's greatest vulnerabilities because physical evidence of his crimes existed in a box that could be found by anyone who searched his apartment thoroughly enough. What made the code so fascinating from a philosophical standpoint was its internal logic. On one level, it was absurd. A code for serial killing is like a diet plan for cannibalism. It doesn't change the fundamental nature of what you're doing. It just adds rules to make it feel more controlled. But on another level, the code represented something genuinely interesting about how human beings process violence and morality. Harry took something that most people would consider pure evil and imposed a framework of rules, rituals, and justifications that made it feel, if not acceptable, then at least comprehensible. The code turned Dexter from a monster into an anti-hero. It gave audiences a reason to root for a serial killer because he was killing people who were, by any reasonable standard, worse than he was. But the code was never as clean as Harry wanted it to be. Throughout the series, Dexter encountered situations where the code failed him. He killed people who turned out to be innocent. He made decisions that violated the spirit of the code even when they technically followed its letter. He used the code to justify actions that were really motivated by self-preservation, revenge, or personal convenience, rather than any genuine pursuit of justice. The code was a tool, and like any tool, it could be misused by the person wielding it. In Season 8 of the original series, a neuropsychiatrist named Dr. Evelyn Vogel arrived in Miami and revealed something that fundamentally changed how viewers understood the code's origin. Vogel had been involved in creating the code. She had worked with Harry Morgan years earlier, helping him develop the behavioral framework that would shape Dexter's entire life. This meant the code was not simply a desperate father's improvisation. It was a clinically designed behavioral modification system created by a mental health professional who believed that psychopathic impulses could be redirected rather than eliminated. Vogel's involvement raised the stakes of what the code represented. It wasn't just Harry's guilt and love driving the experiment. There was actual clinical theory behind it, which made it both more sophisticated and more troubling. Harry's health deteriorated under the weight of what he had created. The stress of raising Dexter, managing his urges, maintaining the secret, and living with the knowledge of what his son was doing took a physical toll. Harry suffered a heart attack during a hunting trip with Dexter, an event depicted in Dexter, Original Sin. He was hospitalized, and while he recovered, the strain of his double life continued to eat at him. Harry carried the knowledge that he had built a serial killer, not accidentally, not through neglect, but through deliberate, systematic training. He had looked at a traumatized child and decided that the best path forward was to teach that child how to kill effectively. And as Dexter grew older and began killing in practice, rather than just in theory, Harry had to confront the reality of what his creation actually looked like. The show depicted Harry witnessing one of Dexter's early kills as an adult. What he saw horrified him. The real thing was nothing like the theoretical framework he had built. The blood, the violence, the cold efficiency with which Dexter dismembered another human being. It was too much. Harry couldn't reconcile the boy he loved with the act he was watching. The series suggests that this realization contributed directly to Harry's death, whether through suicide or through the cumulative psychological collapse of a man who could no longer bear what he had done. Either way, Harry died carrying the knowledge that his experiment had worked exactly as designed and that the results were monstrous. After Harry's death, Dexter continued following the code, but now he followed it as a kind of religion. Harry was gone, but his rules remained. And in a device that the show used brilliantly throughout all 8 seasons, Dexter began seeing visions of Harry. These were not supernatural visitations, they were Dexter's own mind generating an internal version of his father, a conscience in the shape of the man who had built him. Ghost Harry, as fans called him, appeared throughout the series to advise, warn, and sometimes argue with Dexter about his choices. He represented the code itself, the voice in Dexter's head that told him when he was following the rules and when he was straying from them. The genius of the code, from a storytelling perspective, was that it gave the audience permission to care about a serial killer. Without the code, Dexter would have been unwatchable. Nobody wants to spend 8 seasons following a random predator who kills for pleasure. But with the code, Dexter became something more complicated. He became a man with rules, a man who believed he was doing something meaningful with his darkness, a man who struggled with the boundaries of his own morality, even if that morality was built on an impossible foundation. The code didn't make Dexter good, but it made him interesting. And it made the question of whether his killings were justified something that viewers could genuinely debate. Harry Morgan built a monster with rules. But rules, as Dexter himself would learn over and over again, are only as strong as the person following them. And the darker the situation became, the harder those rules were to maintain. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The code gave Dexter a framework for his violence, but it didn't explain the force that drove him to kill in the first place. Dexter had his own name for that force. He called it the Dark Passenger. Throughout the entire run of Dexter, from the first episode of the original series in 2006 to the franchise's latest installments, one concept appears more consistently than any other. Dexter Morgan refers to his compulsion to kill as the Dark Passenger. It's a term he uses so frequently and with such conviction that it becomes part of how he understands himself. The Dark Passenger is not just a metaphor in Dexter's mind, it's an entity, a force separate from himself that drives him to violence and gives him no choice in the matter. When Dexter feels the urge to kill, he doesn't say he wants to kill someone. He says the Dark Passenger wants it. When he can't resist those urges, he doesn't say he failed to control himself. He says the Dark Passenger was driving. This distinction matters enormously because the question of whether the Dark Passenger is real or just a story Dexter tells himself to avoid responsibility is one of the deepest philosophical threads running through the entire franchise. The term itself is Dexter's invention. Harry didn't come up with it. In a revealing conversation that takes place in Season 7, a ghostly vision of Harry tells Dexter directly that the Dark Passenger was Dexter's own creation. Harry says he gave Dexter the code, but the Dark Passenger was all Dexter. When Dexter pushes back and says that Harry once told him the darkness got into him too early, Back in the shipping container, Harry clarifies. He says he meant Dexter was traumatized, not possessed. He remembers the first time Dexter used the phrase. Dexter was about 12 years old, and Harry just let it go at the time because he couldn't expect a young boy to understand feelings that complicated. But Harry makes it clear that the Dark Passenger was never something Harry endorsed as a real external force. It was a coping mechanism that Dexter developed to externalize something he couldn't face directly. This conversation is devastating because of what it implies. If the Dark Passenger isn't a real entity, if it's just a name Dexter gave to his own desires, then Dexter is fully responsible for every kill he's ever committed. Every time he said the Dark Passenger made him do it, he was lying to himself. Every time he described his urges as something beyond his control, he was choosing to frame his own choices as compulsions. Dexter himself acknowledges this in the same conversation. He says, and this is one of the most important lines in the entire series, because if there's no Dark Passenger, then I'm responsible for everything I've done. And Harry's ghost responds by saying it's a whole lot simpler to just pin the blame on something else. Then he delivers the truly chilling line. It's much scarier to think that the Dark Passenger is no more real than I am. Think about what Harry is saying there. The ghostly vision of Harry that Dexter has been talking to for years, the conscience that appears in his mind and helps him navigate moral decisions, isn't real. It's a projection of Dexter's own psyche. And if Harry's ghost isn't real and the Dark Passenger isn't real, then Dexter is completely alone with his own nature. There is no external force compelling him. There is no dead father guiding him. There is just Dexter, a man who wants to kill and who has constructed an elaborate internal mythology to make that want feel like something other than a choice. Another character who challenged the Dark Passenger concept was Hannah McKay, a woman Dexter became romantically involved with in Season 7. Hannah was herself a killer. She had poisoned multiple people over the course of her life. But unlike Dexter, Hannah didn't have a Dark Passenger. She didn't blame her violence on an external force or describe it as a compulsion beyond her control. When Dexter explained the Dark Passenger concept to her, Hannah's response was straightforward. She told him he wasn't a puppet, and that of course he had a choice. When Dexter insisted that his need to kill was different from normal anger, that he had to follow through where other people just felt the impulse, Hannah pointed out that she followed through too, and she didn't need to invent a Dark Passenger to explain why. Hannah saw through the construct immediately. She recognized it as what it was, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed Dexter to avoid owning his actions. The Dark Passenger serves a specific function in Dexter's psychology. By externalizing his violent impulses and treating them as a separate entity, Dexter preserves his ability to see himself as something other than simply a murderer. He's not a bad person. He's a person with a bad thing inside him. The distinction allows him to maintain relationships, to care about his sister Deborah, to love his son Harrison, to function in society. If he fully accepted that the violence was just him, that there was no passenger and no possession and no force beyond his own desires, the psychological scaffolding that allows him to live a double life would collapse. The Dark Passenger is the wall between Dexter the killer and Dexter the person. Without it, there's just one Dexter, and that Dexter is a serial murderer who enjoys what he does. The source novels by Jeff Lindsay actually went in a very different direction with the Dark Passenger. In the books, the Dark Passenger eventually became a literal supernatural entity. Lindsay's later novels suggested that the Dark Passenger was some kind of ancient, malevolent spirit that inhabited certain people and drove them to violence. This was a genuine metaphysical force in the book universe, not a psychological construct. The television series explicitly rejected this interpretation. The show's writers grounded Dexter's psychology in trauma and choice rather than the supernatural. In the TV version of Dexter, there are no demons, no possessions, no external forces of evil. There is only a man who was traumatized as a child and who developed violent compulsions as a result. The show treated the Dark Passenger as something psychological, making it far more disturbing because it meant that Dexter's violence was human rather than otherworldly. Dexter's kill ritual was closely connected to the Dark Passenger concept. Every element of how Dexter killed served a specific psychological function. The plastic wrap that he used to cover every surface of his kill rooms represented control. In the shipping container where his mother died, there was chaos. Blood everywhere, no order, no logic, just random violence and terror. Dexter's kill rooms were the opposite. They were meticulously prepared environments where every surface was covered, every tool was laid out in advance, and every step followed a predetermined sequence. The plastic wrap was Dexter imposing order on the chaos that had defined the worst moment of his life. He was taking the act of killing, which had been inflicted on his mother in the most brutal and disorganized way possible, and transforming it into something precise and controlled. The blood slides were another element of the ritual. After killing a victim, Dexter would make a small cut, usually on the cheek, and collect a drop of blood on a glass microscope slide. He stored these slides in a wooden box hidden inside the air conditioning unit of his apartment. The slides served as trophies. They were proof that each kill had happened, a physical record of Dexter's work. But they were also evidence, tangible, damning evidence that connected Dexter to dozens of murders. Keeping them was an enormous risk, and Dexter knew it, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. The slides were too important to his sense of identity. They were the physical manifestation of the dark passenger's work, and destroying them would feel like destroying part of himself. The blood slides became central to multiple storylines throughout the series. In Season 2, when Dexter's underwater body dump site was discovered by divers, the investigation that followed threatened to connect Dexter to the Bay Harbor butcher killings. The slides were a constant liability. In Season 7, Maria LaGuerta found a blood slide at the scene where Dexter killed Travis Marshall, and that single slide became the thread she pulled that nearly unraveled Dexter's entire secret. The slides were Dexter's addiction within his addiction. He was addicted to killing, and within that addiction, he was addicted to keeping proof of it. The compulsion to maintain the collection overrode his rational understanding that the slides could get him caught and executed. Dexter's internal monologue, which played constantly throughout the original series as a voiceover narration, was the audience's primary window into the dark passenger's world. Through this narration, viewers heard Dexter describe his urges, his thought processes, and his emotional responses to the events around him. What made the narration so effective was its calm, analytical tone. Dexter didn't narrate like a man tormented by violent impulses. He narrated like a scientist observing his own behavior with clinical detachment. He described his kills the way a surgeon might describe an operation: precise, measured, and focused on technique. This detachment was itself a product of the dark passenger construct. By treating his violence as something observed rather than something chosen, Dexter maintained emotional distance from the reality of what he was doing. The very first narration of the series established this tone perfectly. My name is Dexter, Dexter Morgan. I don't know what made me the way I am, but whatever it was left a hollow place inside. People fake a lot of human interactions, but I feel like I fake them all, and I fake them very well. And that's my burden, I guess. Those opening words accomplished something remarkable. They made the audience complicit. By sharing his inner thoughts with us, Dexter made us his confidants. We knew things his colleagues didn't know. We knew things his family didn't know. We were inside the mind of a serial killer, and the narration's calm, self-aware tone made us comfortable there. That comfort was itself a kind of manipulation, not by Dexter, but by the show's creators. They trained us to see the world through a killer's eyes, and by the time we realized how deeply we had been drawn in, it was too late to pull back. Dexter's daily life in Miami was presented with a specificity that grounded the show's more extreme elements in mundane reality. He lived on the top floor of a 2-story apartment complex with a swimming pool. His apartment was meticulously organized, reflecting the same need for order that defined his kill rooms. He worked as a blood spatter analyst for the Miami Metro Police Department, arriving at crime scenes to examine the patterns left by violence and translate them into forensic evidence. It was a perfect job for a serial killer. Dexter spent his days surrounded by the aftermath of murder, studying the methods and mistakes of other killers, and using that knowledge to refine his own technique. He was, in a very literal sense, learning from the competition. His boat, the slice of life, was both his means of disposal and his sanctuary. After each kill, Dexter would take the dismembered remains out onto the water and dump them in a specific location where the current and depth would prevent recovery. The boat was where Dexter was most himself. On the water, alone, with the remains of his latest target sealed in black garbage bags, he could drop the mask entirely. No colleagues to perform for, no family to pretend with. Just the ocean and the silence and the satisfaction of a ritual completed according to plan. The show's opening credits became iconic for the way they transformed ordinary morning activities into something sinister. Dexter shaving, Dexter making breakfast, Dexter squeezing an orange, Dexter tying his shoes, Dexter putting on a shirt. Every mundane act was filmed with extreme close-ups and a slightly off-kilter visual style that made the familiar feel threatening. The credits were set to Rolf Kent's main title theme, a piece of music that managed to be simultaneously playful and unsettling, capturing the dual nature of a man whose morning routine included both making coffee and concealing evidence of murder. The opening sequence ran unchanged throughout all 8 seasons of the original series, becoming one of the most recognizable title sequences in television history. Dexter's relationship with the Miami Metro Homicide Division was built on years of careful performance. His colleagues liked him, they trusted him. They considered him a valuable, if slightly odd, member of the team. Angel Batista treated him as a friend. Masuka cracked inappropriate jokes with him. Quinn was occasionally suspicious, but never pursued those suspicions seriously. And Deborah, of course, considered him her closest family. Dexter navigated these relationships with the careful attention of an actor who never broke character. He laughed at the right moments. He expressed concern at the right moments. He offered help and advice when it was expected. He attended departmental events and made himself useful in ways that built goodwill without attracting too much scrutiny. It was a masterclass in social engineering, sustained over years, and it worked because Dexter's colleagues had no framework for imagining that the quiet, helpful bloodspatter analyst was anything other than what he appeared to be. The one person who saw through the performance from the beginning was Sergeant James Doakes. Something about Dexter triggered Doakes' instincts in a way that no amount of social engineering could overcome. Doakes was a man who had seen real predators. He had served in military black operations. He had looked evil in the face. And when he looked at Dexter, he saw something that the cheerful, helpful mask couldn't quite conceal. Doakes didn't have evidence. He didn't have a theory about what Dexter was doing. He just knew on a gut level that the mild-mannered lab technician was hiding something dangerous. And he was right. He was the only person at Miami Metro who was right. And as we've already discussed, being right about Dexter Morgan was a death sentence. The Dark Passenger also affected how Dexter experienced human emotions. Throughout the series, Dexter frequently described himself as unable to feel genuine emotions. He said he faked all human interactions. He described himself as hollow, empty, lacking the capacity for real connection. This self-assessment was essential to the Dark Passenger narrative because it positioned Dexter as fundamentally different from other people. Not just behaviorally different because he killed, but neurologically and emotionally different because he couldn't feel. However, the show repeatedly contradicted Dexter's self-assessment through his actions. He clearly cared about Deborah. He loved Rita, even if he struggled to articulate it. He was devastated by certain losses and genuinely protective of his son Harrison. The gap between what Dexter said about himself and what he actually felt was one of the show's most interesting tensions. He told himself he couldn't feel emotions because admitting he could feel them would make his killing harder to justify. If you can feel empathy and you kill anyway, you're making a moral choice. If you can't feel empathy, you're simply operating according to your nature. The show's most famous line connected to the Dark Passenger came from an unlikely source. Dexter's catchphrase throughout the series was, "Tonight's the night," a line from his internal monologue that he used when preparing for a kill. But it was Dexter's casual utterance of "wubba lubba dub dub" that, wait, wrong show? It was actually Dexter's recurring opening monologue introduction, "Tonight's the night," that became the franchise's signature phrase, used prominently in promotional materials and deeply associated with the character's predatory preparations. The phrase captured the Dark Passenger perfectly. It was calm, anticipatory, almost cheerful. It was the voice of a man looking forward to killing the way most people look forward to dinner. The Dark Passenger concept raised questions that extended beyond the show itself. How much of human behavior is choice and how much is compulsion? When we say someone can't help doing something destructive, are we describing a genuine inability or a convenient excuse? Dexter's Dark Passenger was compelling precisely because it occupied the ambiguous space between those two possibilities. Maybe Dexter genuinely couldn't control his urges. The trauma of watching his mother dismembered at age 3 might have damaged his brain in ways that made violence as unavoidable as breathing. Or maybe Dexter was a man who enjoyed killing, constructed an elaborate psychological framework to avoid feeling guilty about it, and used the language of compulsion to make his choices seem inevitable. The show never gave a definitive answer. It left the question open, and that openness is what made Dexter Morgan one of the most debated characters in television history. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The Dark Passenger was the force inside Dexter, but the first person from outside to truly test everything Harry built was someone who shared Dexter's blood, his trauma, and his rage, his own brother. Season 1 of Dexter introduced a serial killer who operated unlike anyone Miami Metro had ever seen. The bodies were drained of blood, dismembered with surgical precision, and arranged in deliberate patterns that seemed designed to communicate something specific. The victims were prostitutes, and the way they were displayed suggested an almost artistic sensibility. The killer was meticulous, theatrical, and completely bloodless in his method. Because the victims were drained before being cut apart, the crime scenes were eerily clean. No pools of blood, no splatter patterns, just pale, neatly arranged pieces of human bodies. Miami Metro dubbed this unknown killer the Ice Truck Killer, and the entire homicide department was consumed by the hunt. What nobody at Miami Metro understood was that the Ice Truck Killer wasn't targeting prostitutes at random. He wasn't driven by sexual motivation or a hatred of sex workers. Every body, every arrangement, every detail of the crime scenes was a message, and the messages were all directed at one person, Dexter Morgan. The Ice Truck Killer was communicating with Dexter, using the bodies as letters in a conversation that only Dexter could read. The killer had infiltrated Dexter's life months before the bodies started appearing. He was operating under the alias Rudy Cooper, presenting himself as a prosthetic specialist who worked at a local hospital. Rudy was charming, intelligent, and immediately likable. He possessed a warmth and social ease that Dexter himself had spent years learning to fake. Where Dexter's charm was studied and mechanical, Rudy's appeared effortless. He could read people instantly, adapt his presentation to match their expectations, and make them feel like the most important person in the room. This was a man who had spent decades honing his ability to manipulate others, and his skills far exceeded Dexter's practiced mimicry. Rudy also happened to start dating Deborah Morgan, Dexter's adoptive sister. This wasn't a coincidence. Every element of Rudy Cooper's life was engineered to bring him closer to Dexter. The relationship with Deborah was a calculated move designed to embed Rudy within Dexter's family, giving him access to Dexter's daily life, his habits, and his emotional connections. The cruelty of this plan becomes apparent when you consider what it meant for Deborah. She fell in love with Rudy. Genuinely, she opened herself up to him emotionally in ways she struggled to do with other people. Deborah, who had always been brash and guarded, allowed herself to be vulnerable with a man who was using her as a tool to access her brother. Rudy proposed to Deborah. He gave her a ring. He let her believe that he loved her. And the entire time, she was nothing to him except a key that opened a door. This is one of the aspects of Season 1 that often gets overlooked in discussions about the Ice Truck Killer arc. Brian Moser didn't just target Dexter. He weaponized Deborah's need for love. He identified her emotional vulnerabilities. He exploited them with precision, and he built a relationship on a foundation of pure deception. When the truth about Rudy was revealed, Deborah wasn't just endangered by a serial killer. She was betrayed by a man she loved. The psychological damage of that betrayal would affect her for the rest of the series, shaping her trust issues, her romantic relationships, and her general approach to human connection. Brian Moser hurt Deborah in ways that went far beyond the physical danger of being kidnapped. He showed her that love could be a weapon, and that the person closest to you might be the person most intent on destroying you. Dexter was fascinated by the Ice Truck Killer from the very beginning, and this fascination itself was a clue that he didn't recognize immediately. As a blood spatter analyst, Dexter was professionally required to examine crime scenes. But his interest in the ice truck killer went far beyond professional curiosity. He felt a strange connection to the killer's work. The precision, the control, the artistry. It reminded him of his own methods, his own need for order and ritual. The ice truck killer was doing something that Dexter recognized on a level deeper than conscious thought. And the killer knew it. That was the whole point. The clues that Brian left for Dexter were intricate and deeply personal. Brian used the number 103 repeatedly, a reference to the October 3rd newspaper article reporting the shipping yard massacre that had destroyed their mother. At the Marina View Hotel, Brian created a crime scene that was designed to trigger Dexter's buried memories. He spilled blood in room 103. He tuned the hotel room's radio to 103 FM. He bookmarked the hotel Bible to Leviticus 10:3, and he set a clock at a nearby location to 1:03 p.m. Each reference pointed to the same date and the same event. Brian was using murder as a language, spelling out the story of their shared past one body at a time, waiting for Dexter to remember. When Dexter entered the blood-soaked hotel room, something broke open inside his mind. The sight of all that blood in an enclosed space triggered a visceral reaction. He had a panic attack, which was extremely unusual for a man who worked with blood every single day. But this was different. The blood wasn't evidence to be analyzed. It was a trigger, pulling up images he had buried for 30 years. Flashes of the shipping container, flashes of his mother. The smell of blood in a confined space overwhelmed his professional detachment and dragged him back to the worst day of his life. Dexter didn't yet understand what these memories meant or where they were coming from, but the ice truck killer's plan was working. Dexter was beginning to remember. As the investigation progressed, Dexter began researching his own past and discovered things Harry had never told him. He learned about the shipping yard massacre. He learned that his biological mother had been murdered. He learned about the shipping container, and he learned something that shocked him to his core. He had a brother, an older brother named Brian Moser, who had been in the container with him, who had witnessed the same horror, and who had been left behind when Harry adopted only Dexter. The pieces began falling into place. The ice truck killer wasn't a random serial killer who happened to be fascinated with Dexter. He was family. Brian Moser's plan reached its climax when he kidnapped Deborah. He took her to their mother's old house, the place where Dexter had lived as a toddler before the massacre, and wrapped her in plastic in a manner identical to how Dexter prepared his own victims. When Dexter arrived, Brian revealed everything. He showed Dexter who he was. He talked about the container, the blood, the 2 days they spent sitting in their mother's remains. He talked about growing up alone in a mental institution while Dexter was raised in a loving home with a family. And then he made his proposal. Brian wanted them to be brothers again. He wanted them to kill together, to embrace what they both were without shame or codes or rules. He wanted Dexter to see that the code of Harry was a cage, not a gift. That Harry had taken something natural and powerful and warped it into something controlled and limited. Brian saw the code as an insult. He saw it as Harry's attempt to neuter what the shipping container had made them. And his final test for Dexter was simple. Kill Deborah. Kill the adoptive sister who represented Harry's world, Harry's values, Harry's replacement family. Choose blood over bonds. Choose what they were born to be over what Harry tried to make them. Dexter was genuinely torn. For a moment, the pull of biological connection, of shared trauma, of someone who truly understood what it was like to be him, was almost overwhelming. Brian was the only person in the world who knew exactly what Dexter had experienced. He was the only person who could look at Dexter's darkness and not flinch, because he carried the same darkness himself. The temptation to join Brian, to abandon the code and everything it represented, was real. It was the single greatest threat to Harry's experiment in the entire first season. But Dexter chose Deborah. He chose the adoptive family over the biological one. He chose Harry's framework over Brian's chaos. And having made that choice, Dexter killed his own brother. He slit Brian's throat and staged the scene to look like a suicide. Deborah was saved. Brian was dead. And Dexter had passed the first great test of the code. What Brian Moser represented, thematically, was the control group in Harry's experiment. Both brothers experienced identical trauma. Both sat in the same blood. Both watched the same murder. but one was given structure, rules, and a framework for managing his violence. The other was given nothing. Brian was what Dexter could have become without the code. He was Dexter with no restraint, no rules, no moral framework. He killed anyone he wanted for any reason he chose, with no system of accountability beyond his own desires. Brian was pure, unfiltered darkness. He was the dark passenger without a driver's license. The tragedy of Brian's story was that his monstrousness was not entirely his fault. He was abandoned by the system. Harry chose to save one brother and left the other to rot in an institution. Brian grew up knowing that someone had looked at him and decided he wasn't worth saving. That rejection, combined with the unprocessed trauma of the shipping container, created something that no amount of therapy could have fixed. Brian never had a chance. He was broken at 3 years old, and nobody ever tried to put him back together. His violence was the natural result of what was done to him, filtered through decades of isolation and rage. But even in killing Brian, Dexter couldn't fully escape him. Brian appeared in later seasons as a vision, similar to the ghostly Harry that advised Dexter throughout the series. Brian's ghost represented the part of Dexter that wanted to abandon the code, the part that whispered that rules were for people who were afraid of what they really were. Brian's presence in Dexter's psyche was a constant reminder that the line between a killer with a code and a killer without one was thinner than Dexter wanted to believe. And in the prequel series Original Sin, Brian appeared again as a lurking figure watching Dexter from afar, suggesting that he had been tracking his younger brother for years before making his move as the ice truck killer. The resolution of Season 1 established a pattern that would repeat throughout the series. Each season would introduce a central antagonist who forced Dexter to confront a specific aspect of his own nature. Brian forced Dexter to confront the question of biological identity versus chosen identity. Was Dexter defined by what the shipping container had made him, or by what Harry had built on top of that foundation? By choosing Deborah over Brian, Dexter chose Harry. He chose the code. He chose the belief that he could be something more than just a product of his trauma. Whether that choice was genuine, or whether it was itself just another form of the dark passenger's self-deception, is something the show would continue to explore for years to come. Brian Moser also established the franchise's central irony. Dexter killed his brother to protect his sister. He chose to end one family bond to preserve another. And the tragedy is that Deborah herself, the person Dexter killed for, the relationship he deemed more important than blood, would eventually be destroyed by Dexter's secret anyway. Everything Dexter did to protect Deborah from Brian was, in the long run, pointless. Because the real threat to Deborah was never the ice truck killer. It was Dexter himself. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Brian Moser proved that Dexter's darkness had biological roots, but what happened next would prove that even the code itself was fragile, and that Dexter's carefully maintained double life could be unraveled by a few garbage bags at the bottom of the ocean. For years, Dexter had been disposing of his victims in the same way. After killing according to the code's ritual, he would dismember the body, seal the pieces in heavy black garbage bags, take them out on his boat, the Slice of Life, and dump them into the ocean. The current and the depth would do the rest. The bags would sink, settle on the ocean floor, and remain hidden forever. It was a clean, efficient system. Dexter had used it dozens of times without any problems. The ocean was supposed to be the ultimate burial ground, permanent, unreachable, and completely beyond the scope of any investigation. Until it wasn't. In Season 2, a group of recreational divers discovered Dexter's dumping ground. They found the bags, they found the bodies, they found evidence of dozens of dismembered victims, carefully cut apart and disposed of in the same manner, all concentrated in one area of the ocean floor off the coast of Miami. What had been Dexter's greatest secret was suddenly his greatest vulnerability. The FBI was called in. Miami Metro went into crisis mode. And the media gave the unknown killer a name that would haunt the series for years to come: the Bay Harbor Butcher. The investigation was led by FBI Special Agent Frank Lundy, a meticulous, experienced profiler who had spent his career tracking serial killers across the country. Lundy was calm, intelligent, and methodical. He was exactly the kind of investigator that Dexter should have feared the most because Lundy didn't operate on gut instinct or emotional reactions. He worked with data, patterns, and evidence. He built profiles based on behavioral analysis, and he was very, very good at what he did. Lundy also happened to develop a romantic interest in Deborah Morgan, which created an additional layer of complexity for Dexter. The man hunting the Bay Harbor butcher was sleeping with Dexter's sister. Dexter found himself in a position that the code had never prepared him for. He was being investigated by his own colleagues inside his own workplace for crimes he had actually committed. Every day, he went to work at Miami Metro and sat in meetings where detectives discussed leads and theories about the Bay Harbor butcher. He analyzed evidence from his own crime scenes. He contributed to the investigation that was hunting him. The irony was suffocating. Dexter was the expert being consulted on how to catch himself, and every contribution he made had to be carefully calibrated. He couldn't be too helpful because that might accidentally lead the investigation in the right direction. And he couldn't be unhelpful because that would look suspicious. But the person who came closest to catching Dexter wasn't Lundy. It was Sergeant James Doakes. Doakes had suspected something was wrong with Dexter from the very beginning of the series. Long before the Bay Harbor butcher investigation, Doakes had followed Dexter, confronted him, and openly told him that there was something off about him. Doakes called Dexter fake and a creep. He told Dexter to his face that he knew something was wrong and that he would prove it. Doakes possessed a predator's instinct for recognizing other predators, and that instinct had been screaming at him about Dexter for years. Doakes escalated his surveillance during Season 2. He followed Dexter to crime scenes. He watched Dexter's movements outside of work. He tracked Dexter's boat. And eventually, Doakes discovered the truth. He found Dexter's kill tools. He found evidence of what Dexter was doing. The confrontation between them was one of the defining moments of the series, crystallized by Doakes' now legendary line. When Doakes surprised Dexter at the shipping yard where Dexter's mother had been murdered, Doakes burst out with, "Surprise, motherfucker!" It became one of the most widely quoted and memed lines in television history, turning up across the internet for years after the episode aired. Dexter captured Doakes and imprisoned him in a remote cabin in the Florida Everglades. This created an impossible moral dilemma that exposed the limits of the code. Doakes was not a killer. He was not guilty of murder. He had not escaped the justice system. By every standard the code established, Doakes was an innocent man. The code explicitly prohibited Dexter from killing innocent people. But Doakes knew Dexter's secret, and if he was released, he would expose everything. Dexter's entire life, his family, his freedom, all of it would end the moment Doakes told anyone what he knew. Dexter agonized over what to do. He kept Doakes imprisoned in the cabin while he tried to figure out a solution that didn't involve killing an innocent man. He brought Doakes food, he maintained the cabin. He was essentially holding a hostage while having a moral crisis about whether his personal code allowed him to eliminate the threat this hostage represented. The code said no, self-preservation said yes. And Dexter, for once, genuinely didn't know which voice to listen to. The resolution came from someone else entirely. Lila West, Dexter's chaotic and toxic love interest during Season 2, discovered the cabin and Doakes inside it. Lila had been Dexter's sponsor in a Narcotics Anonymous program that Dexter had joined as a cover story, and she had become obsessively attached to him. When she found Doakes, she understood immediately what was at stake, and without consulting Dexter or asking for his approval, Lila blew up the cabin with Doakes inside. Doakes died in the explosion, and in the aftermath, he was framed as the Bay Harbor butcher. The investigation concluded that Doakes had been the serial killer all along. The evidence was circumstantial but convincing enough. Doakes had been a military man with combat experience. He had the skills and the temperament that the profile suggested. He had been found dead at a remote cabin in the Everglades, surrounded by evidence that was interpreted as proof of his guilt. The case was closed. The Bay Harbor butcher was dead. Miami could breathe again. Except everything about that conclusion was wrong. James Doakes was not the Bay Harbor butcher. He was the one person at Miami Metro who had been right about Dexter from the very beginning. His instincts had been perfect. His suspicions had been completely justified. He had done exactly what a good cop should do when he suspects a colleague of criminal activity. And for that, he was murdered, framed as a serial killer, and buried with a legacy that labeled him a monster. His name became synonymous with the Bay Harbor butcher. His reputation was destroyed posthumously. Everything he worked for, his career, his honor, his place in the department, was erased and replaced with a lie. Dexter attended Doakes' memorial service. The man who was actually the Bay Harbor butcher stood among his colleagues and participated in the public mourning of the man who had been framed for his crimes. If there was ever a moment that captured the grotesque nature of Dexter's double life, this was it. He was a serial killer grieving alongside the colleagues he deceived daily for a man he had effectively murdered by failing to prevent his death, a man whose only crime was being right. After the cabin explosion, Dexter tracked Lila to Paris. She had fled the country, but Dexter followed her. He killed Lila in her Paris apartment, eliminating the last person who knew the full truth about what had happened to Doakes. With Lila dead and Doakes framed, every loose end was tied up. The Bay Harbor butcher case was officially closed, and Dexter was free. But the case didn't stay closed forever. Years later, in Season 7, Captain Maria LaGuerta found a bloodslide at the crime scene where Dexter killed Travis Marshall. LaGuerta was a shrewd, ambitious woman who had known Doakes well. She had always harbored doubts about the official conclusion of the Bay Harbor butcher case. The bloodslide reignited those doubts. She began investigating quietly, pulling at threads that connected back to Dexter. She discovered that Dexter had moved his boat in 2007 when the original investigation was closing in on his marina. She found connections between the butcher's victim profile and Dexter's access to police databases. She started building a case. LaGuerta's investigation was the slow-burning fuse that would eventually detonate in the Season 7 finale. She got closer and closer to the truth, and Dexter found himself once again facing the prospect of exposure. But this time, the consequences wouldn't be limited to Dexter alone. Deborah now knew his secret. Deborah had been living with the knowledge of what her brother was. And when LaGuerta's investigation threatened to expose everything, it was Deborah who pulled the trigger, literally. In the shipping container where their mother had been murdered decades earlier, Deborah shot and killed Maria LaGuerta to protect Dexter's secret. The Bay Harbor butcher case demonstrated something fundamental about the code's limitations. The code was designed to prevent Dexter from killing innocent people. But the code couldn't prevent innocent people from being destroyed by the consequences of Dexter's existence. Doakes didn't have to die for the code to fail. He just had to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, investigating the wrong person, and the system of violence that Dexter had built would consume him regardless of whether Dexter pulled the trigger himself. The code protected Dexter from certain kinds of moral failure. It did not protect the people around him from being collateral damage in his secret war. Doakes deserved better. He was a good cop with good instincts who did everything right, and the system rewarded him with a cabin explosion and a posthumous frame job. His ghost hangs over the entire series, a reminder that Dexter's double life wasn't just about Dexter. Real people paid real prices for the secret he maintained, and the price was always higher for the innocent than it was for Dexter himself. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The Bay Harbor butcher case nearly destroyed Dexter, but the real destruction was still coming. It arrived in the form of a man named Arthur Mitchell, and it would cost Dexter everything he loved. If you ask fans of the Dexter franchise which season was the best, the answer is almost always Season 4, and the reason is almost always the same person, Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity Killer. Played by John Lithgow in a performance that won him a Golden Globe and a Screen Actors Guild Award, Arthur Mitchell is widely considered the greatest antagonist in the history of the show. Not because he was the most violent, not because he was the most clever, but because he was the most revealing. Arthur Mitchell showed Dexter and the audience exactly what a serial killer looks like when he successfully maintains a double life for decades. And the picture was horrifying. When FBI Special Agent Frank Lundy first identified the pattern, he dubbed the unknown killer the Trinity Killer because the murders followed a cycle of 3. In each city where the killer operated, 3 people would die in the same sequence. First, a young woman would be bled to death in a bathtub. Then, a woman would be forced to jump from a tall building. Finally, a man would be beaten to death with a hammer or similar blunt instrument. After completing this trinity of kills, the killer would move on to a new city and begin again. Lundy estimated the cycle had been repeating for approximately 30 years, across dozens of cities across the United States. The FBI never officially accepted Lundy's theory that a single killer was responsible. But Lundy was right, and the killer was Arthur Mitchell. What made Arthur Mitchell unique among Dexter's antagonists was his surface life. Previous villains had been clearly unstable, obviously damaged, visibly wrong in some way that marked them as different from normal people. Arthur Mitchell was the opposite. When Dexter first tracked him down, he expected to find a monster. What he found instead was a church deacon, a volunteer with a charity called 4 Walls, 1 Heart that built houses for people in need, a husband with a wife named Sally, a father with a son named Jonah, and a daughter named Rebecca. Arthur Mitchell lived in a nice suburban home. He attended church regularly. His neighbors liked him. His community respected him. He had been hiding in plain sight for 3 decades, maintaining a perfect disguise of normalcy while systematically murdering people across the country. Dexter was fascinated, and that fascination was the beginning of his downfall, because what Dexter saw in Arthur Mitchell was something he desperately wanted for himself. Proof that it was possible, proof that a serial killer could have a real family, could maintain real relationships, could live a complete, functional human life while carrying the dark passenger inside. Arthur Mitchell had done it for 30 years. He had a wife who loved him, kids who respected him, a community that admired him. He had somehow threaded the needle that Dexter was constantly struggling with, balancing the demands of his secret life with the obligations of his public one. Dexter infiltrated Arthur's life using the alias Kyle Butler. He joined Arthur's charity builds. He attended Arthur's church, singing hymns alongside a man he planned to eventually kill. He visited Arthur's home and met his family. He studied Arthur's schedule obsessively, mapping out every hour of every day. Arthur was up at 6, breakfast at 7, at work by 8:30 on Saturdays for a high school study session, lunch at noon, left at 3, dinner at 6. Father, husband, teacher, deacon, all in the name of blending in, Dexter observed. Camouflage is nature's craftiest trick. But the closer Dexter got to Arthur Mitchell, the more the facade cracked. Arthur was not the model family man he appeared to be. Behind the closed doors of his suburban home, Arthur was a tyrant. He controlled his family through fear and intimidation. When his daughter Rebecca failed to water the flowers correctly, Arthur berated her publicly. When his son Jonah didn't wax the car to Arthur's standards, Arthur humiliated him in front of Dexter. His wife Sally moved through the house with the careful, measured steps of a woman who had learned exactly how far she could go before triggering her husband's rage. The family that Dexter envied was actually a prison. Arthur hadn't figured out how to balance darkness with domesticity. He had figured out how to use domesticity as another form of control. His family wasn't a source of love and connection. It was a collection of hostages, people who were too afraid to leave and too conditioned to resist. Arthur's ability to maintain a family life for 30 years wasn't a triumph of compartmentalization. It was a triumph of domestic abuse. The mask he wore for the outside world was the charming deacon and devoted volunteer. The face his family saw was something entirely different. This was the dark answer to Dexter's question: can a serial killer have a real family? Arthur proved that the answer was technically yes, but the cost was the family itself. Arthur's wife and children were not partners in a life. They were props in a performance. They existed to validate Arthur's disguise, to make the outside world believe he was normal, and to bear the private weight of everything he actually was. Dexter looked at Arthur Mitchell and saw a mirror. And what the mirror showed him was not hope. It was horror. The Season 4 arc built slowly, with Dexter inserting himself deeper and deeper into Arthur's life. He learned that Arthur's kill cycle was connected to events from Arthur's childhood. Arthur had witnessed his sister's death in a bathtub. His mother had jumped from a building after the sister's death, and Arthur's father had beaten him violently. The trinity of kills wasn't random. It was Arthur reenacting the 3 traumas that had defined him over and over in city after city for 3 decades. He was trapped in a loop of compulsive repetition, driven to recreate the worst moments of his life through the bodies of strangers. Each cycle was both a memorial and a punishment, a way of remembering what happened and a way of making the world share his pain. Dexter had multiple opportunities to kill Arthur Mitchell during Season 4. There were moments when Arthur was vulnerable, when the logistics were favorable, when everything aligned for a clean kill. But Dexter hesitated. He kept finding reasons to wait. He told himself he needed to learn more. He told himself the timing wasn't right. He told himself he wanted to understand Arthur's methods better. But the real reason Dexter delayed was simpler and sadder than any of those justifications. Dexter didn't want Arthur to be gone yet. Arthur was the only person in the world, other than Brian, who truly understood what it was like to be Dexter. He was a fellow traveler on the same dark road, and Dexter wasn't ready to kill the only mirror that had ever shown him his own reflection. That hesitation was the most consequential mistake Dexter ever made, because while Dexter was studying Arthur, Arthur was studying Dexter, and Arthur was smarter than Dexter gave him credit for. The breaking point came when Arthur visited the Miami Metro Homicide Department. He walked through the building's security using a stolen visitor's pass, and while wandering the halls, he spotted a photograph of Dexter on the wall. It was a bowling team photo, labeled Miami Metro Homicide Bowling Team. Arthur saw the photo, he saw the name, and just like that, the alias of Kyle Butler was useless. Arthur Mitchell now knew exactly who Dexter was, his real name, where he worked, and by extension, where he lived, who his family was, and how to reach them. Dexter noticed Arthur in the building, and the two men walked toward each other in one of the most tension-filled scenes in the series. They stopped face to face. Arthur looked down at Dexter's badge, read his name, and said calmly, "Hello, Dexter Morgan." It was a death sentence disguised as a greeting. Arthur told Dexter to disappear from his life, and then his family would be safe. As he walked toward the elevator, Arthur delivered one final insult. "If I were you, I'd give up vigilantism. You're not very good at it." What happened next moved fast. Dexter pursued Arthur relentlessly, determined to kill him before Arthur could retaliate. But Arthur stayed one step ahead, and while Dexter was focused on the hunt, Arthur made his move, not against Dexter directly, against Dexter's family. Arthur Mitchell went to Dexter's house while Dexter was away, and he murdered Rita Morgan, Dexter's wife, the mother of his infant son, Harrison. Arthur killed Rita using his signature method, cutting her femoral artery and letting her bleed out in the bathtub. When Dexter finally returned home after killing Arthur Mitchell in his own apartment, feeling like the nightmare was over, he walked through his front door expecting to find his family. Instead, he found his phone ringing with a voicemail from Rita. She was calling to tell him she'd forgotten her ID and had come back home. When Dexter walked into the bathroom, he found Rita dead in the tub, the water red with her blood. And sitting on the bathroom floor in a pool of his mother's blood was Harrison, Dexter's infant son, sitting in blood, just like Dexter had sat in blood in the shipping container 30 years earlier. The mirroring was devastating in its precision. The cycle had repeated. The sins of the father had been visited upon the son. Harrison had now experienced the same foundational trauma that had created Dexter. He had been born in blood, just as Dexter had been born in blood, and the question that would haunt the franchise for the next decade was immediate and terrible. Had Arthur Mitchell created another Dexter? Had the violence that Dexter carried, the violence that had been passed to him through trauma in that shipping container, now been passed to Harrison through trauma in that bathtub? Dexter killed Arthur Mitchell in the Season 4 finale, The Getaway. After Arthur fled Miami, Dexter sabotaged his car by removing the oil cap. When Arthur's engine died on a deserted country road, Dexter ambushed him, knocked him down, and captured him. Arthur woke up in Dexter's kill room, immobilized by plastic wrap, staring at photographs of his victims pinned to the walls. Dexter confronted him one final time. But the victory was hollow. Rita was dead. Harrison was potentially damaged in ways that might not become apparent for years. And Dexter knew with absolute certainty that Rita died because he had hesitated. If he had killed Arthur when he first had the chance, weeks earlier, Rita would still be alive. His desire to study Arthur, to learn from him, to see his own reflection in another killer's eyes, had cost him the person he loved most. Season 4 of Dexter is often cited as the peak of the entire franchise, and the reason is the devastating simplicity of its thesis. Arthur Mitchell showed Dexter that the life he wanted, a life where he could be both a serial killer and a good husband and father, was a lie. It wasn't possible. The two identities couldn't coexist. One would always consume the other. Arthur had tried it for 30 years, and the result was a family destroyed by fear and a trail of bodies stretching across the country. Dexter tried it for a few years, and the result was his wife bleeding out in a bathtub and his son sitting in her blood. The Trinity Killer was the monster in the mirror, and the reflection destroyed everything. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Rita's death changed everything for Dexter, but the consequences kept building, and the next great rupture would come from the person who loved him most. After Rita's murder, Dexter was shattered in a way the audience had never seen. Season 5 opened with a raw, unfiltered portrayal of grief that was startling for a character who had spent 4 seasons claiming he couldn't feel genuine emotions. While choosing a moving van to rent, Dexter encountered a man in the restroom who was rude to him. Dexter told the man he'd had a bad week and that his wife had died. The man responded with a vile insult about Rita. Dexter beat him to death with a grappling hook. It was the first time Dexter had killed someone out of pure rage rather than the code's disciplined ritual. No plastic wrap, no verification, no blood slide, just violence. When Harry's ghost appeared in the bathroom mirror afterward, he told Dexter something unexpected. He said it was the first human thing Dexter had done since his wife's death. Harry, the man who had built the code to prevent exactly this kind of uncontrolled killing, recognized that Dexter's rage was grief, and grief was human. It was an acknowledgement that sometimes the code's structure was itself a barrier to genuine emotional experience. Dexter had spent so long channeling his violence through the code's filters that he had forgotten what it felt like to act from raw emotion. The restroom killing was terrible, but it was honest. Dexter returned to his colleagues for Rita's funeral, where he gave a heartfelt eulogy and realized for the first time that he had truly loved her. The realization came too late, as realizations about love so often do in this franchise. Rita was dead because of Dexter. She was dead because he had pursued Arthur Mitchell with more interest in studying a fellow killer than in eliminating a threat. And now Dexter had to live with the knowledge that his curiosity had killed the woman who loved him. Season 5 paired Dexter with Lumen Pierce, a woman who had been kidnapped, raped, and nearly killed by a ring of wealthy, influential men who preyed on women for sport. Lumen had survived, but she was damaged in ways that Dexter recognized. She carried her own version of the dark passenger, a need for revenge that felt less like a choice and more like a compulsion. Dexter and Lumen formed a partnership that was part romantic relationship and part vigilante alliance, hunting down the members of the ring one by one. What made the Dexter and Lumen dynamic interesting was that it tested whether Dexter's methods could genuinely help another person. Every previous target had been someone Dexter killed for his own satisfaction, justified through the code but ultimately driven by the dark passenger's hunger. Lumen's targets were different. She wasn't killing because she enjoyed it. She was killing because she needed to reclaim something that had been taken from her. And Dexter was helping her, not as a fellow predator, but as something closer to a protector. When the ring was dismantled and Lumen's need for revenge was satisfied, something remarkable happened. Lumen's dark passenger faded. The compulsion that had driven her evaporated once its purpose was fulfilled. She thanked Dexter, told him she was leaving, and walked away from Miami with something approaching peace. She didn't need to kill again. The violence had served its purpose and was no longer necessary. Dexter watched Lumen leave and understood what her departure meant. For some people, violence is a response to trauma that eventually heals. The wound closes, the need subsides, life moves on. But Dexter's dark passenger didn't fade. It hadn't faded when Brian was killed, when the Bay Harbor butcher case was closed, when Rita was murdered, or when any other crisis resolved itself. No matter what happened in Dexter's external life, the internal compulsion remained constant. Lumen's departure proved that Dexter's condition was fundamentally different from a trauma response. It was permanent, it was structural, it was who he was. Season 5 also introduced a corrupt cop named Stan Liddy, played by Peter Weller, who discovered Dexter's secret through independent investigation. Liddy represented another person outside the code's framework who stumbled onto the truth and paid the price. Dexter killed Liddy to protect his secret, adding another body to the growing list of people who died, not because they were killers, but because they got too close to one. Meanwhile, Deborah was running her own investigation into the vigilante duo that Dexter and Lumen had become, though she didn't know it was her brother. Deborah came close to the truth multiple times during Season 5, but the show kept her just outside the radius of discovery, building toward the inevitable revelation that was still a season away. Season 6 took a significantly different creative direction. The central antagonists were Travis Marshall, a religious zealot, and Professor James Geller, an academic who appeared to be guiding Travis in staging elaborate murder tableaux based on the Book of Revelation. The crime scenes were theatrical and disturbing, featuring imagery drawn directly from apocalyptic biblical texts. Bodies were arranged to represent the four horsemen. Victims were displayed as tableaux of plagues and judgments. The killer, or killers, seemed to be enacting a literal version of the end times across Miami. The season's central twist, revealed midway through, was that Geller was already dead. Travis had murdered his professor and was hallucinating Geller's continued presence, believing the dead man was guiding him toward fulfilling biblical prophecy. The hallucinated Geller was authoritative, calm, and directive, giving Travis instructions and encouragement while Travis carried out increasingly violent acts. The parallel to Dexter's own experience was immediate and unsettling. Dexter had been seeing visions of his dead father Harry for the entire run of the series. Harry appeared to Dexter as a guiding presence, offering advice, expressing concern, arguing about moral choices. Harry's ghost was such an established part of the show's narrative that audiences had stopped thinking of it as unusual. But Travis and Geller held up a mirror. A man talking to a dead mentor, following instructions from a voice in his head, committing violence based on a framework that only he could see. The mechanism was identical. The only difference was that Dexter's hallucinated mentor counseled selective, disciplined violence, while Travis's hallucinated mentor counseled apocalyptic destruction. This parallel forced viewers to reconsider Harry's role in the show. Was the ghostly Harry a benign presence, a remnant of good parenting that helped Dexter navigate moral complexity? Or was he the same kind of delusion that drove Travis Marshall to arrange bodies as biblical prophecies? The show didn't answer directly, but the comparison was uncomfortable by design. Seeing a dead person and following their instructions is, clinically speaking, the same phenomenon regardless of whether the instructions are follow the code or B, bring about revelation. Season 6 also explored Dexter's relationship with religion and meaning. For the first time in the series, Dexter genuinely considered whether a higher power existed and whether his life had some kind of spiritual significance. He attended church, he participated in religious discussions, he questioned whether the code was sufficient as a moral framework or whether something larger was needed. This was Dexter at his most philosophically searching, looking beyond Harry's behavioral system for something that might give his existence purpose beyond the next kill. He didn't find it. The season ultimately rejected the idea that religious meaning could provide what Dexter was looking for, but the search itself was revealing, showing that even a man as committed to nihilistic pragmatism as Dexter felt the pull of wanting his life to mean something. Dexter tracked Travis to a church and killed him there, wrapping the scene in his signature plastic sheeting and performing his ritual. And then something happened that the series had been building toward for 6 seasons, the moment that changed everything. Deborah walked in. Deborah Morgan, Dexter's adoptive sister, the lieutenant of the Miami Metro Homicide Division, walked into that church and saw her brother standing over a dead body wrapped in plastic, holding a knife. She saw the kill room, she saw the ritual, she saw everything. After 6 seasons of close calls, near misses, and circumstances that kept Deborah just barely outside the truth finally caught up with her. Season 7 opened with the immediate aftermath. Deborah ran from the church. Dexter chased her. She stopped in the parking lot and vomited. He caught up to her and tried to explain. She wouldn't let him touch her. She asked him how long this had been going on. He told her since he was 20. He told her Harry had taught him a code. He told her he only killed certain kinds of people, people who were guilty, people who had escaped justice. And then he told her the part that destroyed her. Harry knew. Their father, the man Deborah had worshipped her entire life, the man she had built her career around honoring, had known what Dexter was and had trained him to do it. That revelation hit Deborah harder than the discovery itself. Learning that Dexter was a killer was devastating. Learning that Harry had made him one was something else entirely. It rewrote Deborah's entire understanding of her childhood, her family, and the man she had loved more than anyone. Harry wasn't just a good cop and a devoted father. He was a man who had secretly trained his adopted son to be a serial killer while raising his biological daughter in ignorance of the monster in the next room. Every memory Deborah had of Harry was now contaminated by this knowledge. Every lesson he had taught her about right and wrong was now undercut by the fact that he had simultaneously been teaching Dexter how to kill and get away with it. Deborah's response to the discovery was the most psychologically realistic element of the entire series. She didn't immediately turn Dexter in, she didn't call the police, she didn't do what a good cop should do, which was arrest her brother and let the system handle it. Instead, she tried to fix it herself. She moved Dexter into her apartment. She slept on the couch near the door so she could monitor his movements. She made him promise to be completely honest with her, and she tried to rehabilitate him as though his compulsion to kill were an addiction that could be managed through supervision and willpower. This was Deborah attempting to be Harry. She was doing what Harry did, trying to control Dexter's behavior through personal intervention rather than institutional response. The difference was that Deborah didn't have Harry's years of preparation. She didn't have a clinical framework. She didn't have Vogel's psychiatric expertise. She had only her love for her brother and her desperate hope that if she just watched him closely enough, she could keep the darkness from consuming him. And like Harry, she discovered that the weight of managing a serial killer is more than one person can bear. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. Deborah couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat normally. She was hyper-vigilant at all times, monitoring Dexter's behavior for any sign that the dark passenger was stirring. She had spent her entire career being the person who chased killers. Now she was living with one, protecting one, and lying to everyone she knew on behalf of one. The cognitive dissonance was destroying her from the inside. During dinner at her apartment on the first night of this arrangement, Dexter explained to Deborah that his need to kill began with seeing blood, which then turned black in his mind. He was describing the dark passenger in terms that made it sound medical, inevitable, like a seizure disorder that happened to manifest as homicide. Deborah listened. She tried to understand, but understanding wasn't the same as accepting, and accepting wasn't the same as being okay with it. Deborah's face during that conversation told the whole story. She was looking at her brother and seeing him for the first time. Not the Dexter she grew up with, not the Dexter who made her feel safe. The real Dexter, the one who described the mechanics of his urge to kill over spaghetti dinner as casually as someone describing a food allergy. What made Deborah's situation particularly cruel was how it connected to Rita's story. Rita Bennett had been Dexter's wife. She had been a kind, slightly fragile woman who had survived an abusive marriage to Paul Bennett and was trying to rebuild her life with a man she believed was safe, dependable, and fundamentally good. Rita never knew who Dexter really was. She married a fiction. She loved a performance. She had children with a man whose real life was completely invisible to her. And she died because of that invisible life, murdered in her own bathtub by a serial killer who targeted her specifically to punish the serial killer she was married to. Rita's death was the franchise's starkest statement about the cost of loving Dexter Morgan. Deborah at least knew the truth when she made her choices. She chose to protect Dexter with full knowledge of what he was. Rita never had that knowledge. She was never given the choice. She loved a lie, and the lie killed her. Every scene of Rita being kind, being trusting, being hopeful about her future with Dexter was retroactively poisoned by the knowledge of how her story ended. She was the franchise's most innocent victim, not because she died, but because she never had the information that would have allowed her to save herself. She couldn't have seen what was coming because the person who should have warned her was the person she trusted most. Deborah's situation in Season 7 was, in some ways, a corrected version of Rita's. Deborah had the information Rita lacked. She knew who Dexter was. She could make informed choices about how to respond. But having the information didn't make the choices easier. If anything, it made them harder, because Deborah was now morally responsible for whatever she decided to do. Rita's ignorance, however tragic, at least absolved her of complicity. Deborah had no such absolution. Every day she spent protecting Dexter instead of turning him in was a choice, and that choice carried weight. Deborah's struggle throughout Season 7 was the emotional center of the show. She was a fundamentally moral person who had dedicated her life to law enforcement. She believed in justice, she believed in the system, she believed that killers should be caught, tried, and punished. And now the person she loved most in the world was the exact kind of criminal she had spent her career pursuing. Every instinct in her body told her to do the right thing. Every emotion in her heart told her she couldn't destroy her brother. Meanwhile, a much more dangerous threat was emerging. Captain Maria LaGuerta had found a bloodslide at the church where Dexter killed Travis Marshall. LaGuerta was experienced, politically savvy, and relentless. She had also been close to Sergeant Doakes, the man who had been framed as the Bay Harbor Butcher. LaGuerta had never fully accepted the official conclusion of that case. She had always harbored doubts about whether Doakes was really the butcher. The bloodslide was the crack that reopened the entire investigation. LaGuerta began digging quietly. She discovered that the blood on the slide belonged to Travis Marshall, the killer Dexter had dispatched at the church. She ran the bloodslide against records and found connections she couldn't ignore. She investigated Dexter's movements during the original Bay Harbor Butcher case. She discovered that he had moved his boat in 2007 when investigators were closing in on his marina. She compiled a list of suspicious police employees who owned boats and narrowed it down to Dexter. She talked to Matthews about the shipping yard where Doakes had died and learned about Santos Jimenez, the man who had murdered Dexter's biological mother. Every thread she pulled connected back to Dexter. LaGuerta also found connections between Dexter's background and the butcher's profile that were impossible to ignore. Brian Moser, the ice truck killer, was Dexter's biological brother. Both boys watched their mother get dismembered. The Bay Harbor Butcher also dismembered his victims. The butcher took blood slides from his kills, and Dexter was a blood spatter analyst. Doakes had always believed something was wrong with Dexter. When LaGuerta laid all of these connections out, the picture was damning. Not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but enough to justify a full investigation. And she was smart enough to conduct that investigation privately, building her case before making it official. The Season 7 finale brought everything to a head in the most symbolically loaded location possible. Dexter lured Hector Estrada, the drug lord who had ordered his mother's murder decades earlier, to a shipping container at the same yard where the shipping yard massacre had occurred. Dexter's plan was to kill Estrada and then frame the scene to make it look like Estrada and LaGuerta had killed each other. It was an elaborate trap designed to eliminate both the man who destroyed his mother and the woman who was closing in on his secret. Dexter killed Estrada inside the container. He asked Estrada if it was hard to make the decision to kill his mother. Estrada called Laura a snitch and said what he did was survival. When Estrada asked what kind of killer Dexter was, Dexter responded with Doakes' words, "I'm just a creep motherfucker." Then he stabbed Estrada in the heart. It was one of the most personal kills of the entire series. Dexter was standing in the same type of container where his mother died, killing the man who ordered her death, using the words of the colleague who had been sacrificed to protect his secret. But the plan fell apart when LaGuerta showed up too quickly. Dexter sedated her with M99 and prepared to stage the crime scene. He was ready to kill LaGuerta, an innocent woman, a good cop, a person who was doing her job correctly and honestly. The code said he couldn't do it, but survival demanded it. And then Deborah arrived. Deborah had been tracking both Dexter and LaGuerta. She arrived at the shipping container and found Dexter standing over the sedated LaGuerta with a knife. LaGuerta woke up, and in the moments that followed, 3 people faced impossible choices in a metal box that had already witnessed the worst moments of the Morgan family's history. LaGuerta, groggy but aware, told Deborah to shoot Dexter. She said Deborah was a good person. She said Deborah knew what was right. Dexter agreed. He looked at his sister and said, "She's right." Then he dropped his knife and told Deborah, "Do what you gotta do." He was giving Deborah permission to arrest him, to end it, to be the good cop she had always been. For one moment, it seemed like Dexter was accepting consequences for the first time in his life. Deborah shot LaGuerta. She didn't shoot Dexter, she shot the woman who was trying to expose him. She shot an innocent captain of the Miami Metro Homicide Division. She shot a good cop. She chose Dexter over justice, family over morality, love over law. And in pulling that trigger, Deborah crossed a line from which there was no return. The episode was titled, "Surprise Motherfucker." Doakes' words, the man who had been right about everything, the man who had been murdered and framed to protect Dexter's secret, had his final line used as the title of the episode, where another innocent person was killed for the same reason. The irony was brutal and deliberate. Deborah collapsed beside LaGuerta's body, sobbing. She had done the one thing she swore she would never do. She had become complicit in murder, not Dexter's controlled, ritualized killing of guilty people. She had killed an innocent woman to protect a serial killer. The code had no provision for this. Harry's framework had no answer. Deborah had stepped outside every moral boundary she had ever known. And she did it for love. The same love that Harry had for Dexter, the love that drove Harry to build the code in the first place, had now led his daughter to commit murder. Deborah's act in the Season 7 finale was the franchise's most devastating statement about what happens to the people who love Dexter Morgan. Harry's love turned him into the architect of a serial killer's training program. Rita's love made her the unsuspecting wife of a man whose secret got her killed. And Deborah's love made her a murderer. Loving Dexter was not just emotionally costly, it was destructive, in a way that warped the moral foundations of everyone it touched. Dexter didn't just kill people, he corrupted them, by existing in their lives, by allowing them to love him, by drawing them into the orbit of his secret. He turned good people into accomplices, enablers, and eventually killers. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Deborah's choice in that shipping container set the stage for the final chapter of the original series, and that chapter would end with Dexter losing the one person he never thought he could lose. Season 8 opened in the aftermath of LaGuerta's death. The official story was that LaGuerta and Hector Estrada had killed each other. It was a clean cover, neat enough to satisfy the department and close the case. But the damage to Deborah was catastrophic. She had killed an innocent woman. She had crossed a moral line that she could never uncross. And unlike Dexter, who had a lifetime of psychological defenses and a dark passenger to absorb the guilt, Deborah had nothing. She was a normal person who had committed murder, and the weight of it was destroying her. Deborah spiraled. She left the police department. She began drinking heavily. She took a job as a private investigator, which put distance between her and the colleagues she could no longer face. She avoided Dexter. She tried to pretend the murder hadn't happened, but it was always there, sitting behind her eyes, coloring every interaction, poisoning every quiet moment. The woman who had once been the moral center of the show, the counterweight to Dexter's darkness, was now consumed by the very darkness she had spent her life fighting. Into this chaos came Dr. Evelyn Vogel. Vogel was a neuropsychiatrist who specialized in the study of psychopathy. She arrived in Miami with a revelation that fundamentally reframed the entire Dexter mythology. Vogel had worked with Harry Morgan decades earlier. She had helped Harry develop the Code of Harry, the behavioral framework that had shaped Dexter's entire life. The set of rules that determined who he killed and how he avoided detection was not solely Harry's creation. It was a collaboration between a guilt-ridden detective and a clinical psychopath researcher who believed that psychopathic impulses could be redirected rather than suppressed. This changed everything. The code was no longer just a father's desperate attempt to manage his son's violence. It was a clinically designed behavior modification system grounded in actual psychiatric theory about how to channel psychopathic tendencies. Vogel had studied Dexter from afar for years, treating him as something between a patient and a research subject. She considered Dexter her greatest accomplishment, proof that her theory about redirecting psychopathy could work in practice. She called herself his spiritual mother, a term that was as creepy as it was revealing. Vogel's presence also created tension within the show's philosophical framework. If the code was clinically designed, then Dexter wasn't just following his father's rules, he was following a treatment protocol. And if it was a treatment protocol, then it raised questions about consent, ethics, and the responsibility of mental health professionals. Harry and Vogel had decided, without Dexter's knowledge or agreement, to train a child as a vigilante killer. They had made that decision when Dexter was too young to understand what was being done to him. By the time he was old enough to choose for himself, the code was already so deeply embedded in his identity that rejecting it felt impossible. Dexter didn't choose the code. The code was chosen for him. Season 8 introduced a new antagonist called the Brain Surgeon, a serial killer who targeted victims by cutting out specific sections of their brains. The Brain Surgeon was eventually revealed to be connected to Vogel. And the season's plot wove together the personal history of Vogel, the ongoing threat of the brain surgeon, and Dexter's plans to leave Miami behind. Because Dexter was planning to run, he had fallen in love with Hannah McKay, the fellow killer from Season 7, and together they were planning to flee to Argentina. Dexter would take Harrison, Hannah would travel separately. They would start a new life in a new country, far from Miami Metro, far from the Bay Harbor butcher case, far from everything that had defined Dexter's life. It was an escape plan born of exhaustion. Dexter was tired of hiding, tired of the double life, tired of watching the people he loved get destroyed by his proximity. But the franchise wasn't going to let Dexter escape that easily. The brain surgeon shot Deborah. The bullet struck her and she was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons operated and initially seemed to save her life. For a brief moment, it appeared that Deborah would survive, that the show's most beloved character would make it through the final season wounded but alive. And then complications set in. A blood clot led to a fatal stroke. When Dexter arrived at the hospital, expecting to find his sister recovering, he found her instead on life support, brain dead, alive in body but gone in mind. The machines were breathing for her. Her heart was beating because electricity told it to. But Deborah, the real Deborah, the foul-mouthed, loyal, fiercely moral woman who had loved Dexter more than anyone else in the world, was already dead. Dexter stood in her hospital room and made the last decision of his life in Miami. He disconnected her life support, he removed the tubes, he let the machines stop. And then he did something that was both tender and horrifying. He picked up Deborah's body, wrapped her in a white sheet, carried her through the hospital and out to the slice of life. Nobody stopped him. Nobody questioned a man carrying a body out of a hospital in broad daylight. It was one of the most criticized scenes in the series, but its emotional impact was undeniable. Dexter was carrying his sister to the sea, the same sea where he had dumped dozens of murder victims. He was giving Deborah the burial that he had given to the killers he dispatched under the code. She deserved better, but Dexter didn't know any other way. He took Deborah out on the water and buried her at sea. He lowered her into the ocean, the same ocean that had received the Bay Harbor butcher's victims, and watched her disappear beneath the surface. Then Dexter did something that looked like suicide. He turned the slice of life directly into Hurricane Laura, a tropical storm that was bearing down on the Florida coast. The hurricane was named Laura, the same name as Dexter's biological mother, the woman whose murder in the shipping container had started everything. Dexter drove his boat straight into the storm and disappeared. The audience was meant to believe he was dead. And for a few minutes of screen time, it seemed like the show was ending with Dexter's suicide. It would have been a fitting conclusion. The man who had spent his life inflicting death had finally turned that violence on himself. The dark passenger had reached its final destination. But then the screen changed. The image shifted to a remote, forested location somewhere far from Miami. And there was Dexter, alive, sitting in a small room, wearing a flannel shirt surrounded by timber. He was a lumberjack, working at a logging camp, alone, isolated, living under what was presumably a false identity, in a place where nobody knew him and nobody would look for him. The final shot of the original series was Dexter sitting at a table, staring directly into the camera. No inner monologue, no voice of Harry offering guidance, no dark passenger narration explaining what he was feeling. Just silence and eyes that seemed completely empty. It was an ending that satisfied almost nobody. The criticism of the finale was immediate and intense. Fans had spent 8 seasons invested in a story that seemed to be building toward one of two outcomes. Either Dexter would be caught and face justice, or Dexter would die. The lumberjack ending delivered neither. Dexter escaped consequences completely. He was alive, free, and unpunished. The people he had destroyed, Doakes, Rita, LaGuerta, and now Deborah, had all paid the ultimate price for Dexter's double life. But Dexter himself paid nothing beyond voluntary exile. He chose to leave. He chose to live in isolation. But he wasn't in prison. He wasn't on death row. He wasn't dead. The show had spent 8 seasons exploring whether a serial killer could maintain a normal life, and the answer it arrived at was that he couldn't. But the punishment for that failure fell on everyone except Dexter. Rita was murdered, Doakes was framed and killed, LaGuerta was shot, and Deborah, the person who loved Dexter the most, who sacrificed the most for him, who compromised everything she believed in to protect him, died on a hospital bed with a blood clot in her brain. Dexter walked away. He always walked away. The decision to end the series with Dexter alive was driven partly by the show's declining quality in its later seasons. After showrunner Clyde Phillips departed following season 4, the show passed through different creative hands. Chip Johannesson took over for season 5, and then Scott Buck ran seasons 6 through 8. The tonal and qualitative shifts were noticeable. The writing became less sharp. The character development became less nuanced. The plotting became more contrived. By season 8, the show felt like it was running on fumes, and the finale reflected that exhaustion. But even within the context of a weaker season, Deborah's death carried genuine weight. Jennifer Carpenter's performance throughout the series had been one of its greatest assets, and the scenes in the hospital with Dexter standing over his sister's body and making the decision to disconnect her life support contained the emotional truth that much of the final season lacked. Deborah died because she loved Dexter. That was the simplest and most devastating summary of her entire arc. She loved her brother so much that she killed for him. And that love led directly to a chain of events that ended with her death. Harrison was sent away with Hannah McKay, Dexter's plan for Argentina apparently still in motion for the people he was leaving behind. Dexter's son, the boy who had been found sitting in his mother's blood in the bathtub, who had been born into the same trauma that created Dexter, was now being raised by a fugitive killer in a foreign country. It wasn't a happy ending for anyone. It was a scattered, unresolved mess that left viewers frustrated and the franchise in limbo. For nearly a decade, this was how the story of Dexter Morgan ended. A lumberjack in the woods, a dead sister at the bottom of the ocean, a son raised by a killer in Argentina, and a legacy of destruction that stretched from a shipping container in 1973 to a hurricane in 2013, touching every person who had ever made the mistake of getting close to Dexter Morgan. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The original series ended with a whimper instead of a bang. But in 2021, the franchise returned, determined to give Dexter the ending he deserved. Whether they succeeded is another question entirely. In October 2020, Showtime announced that Dexter was coming back. The revival was conceived as a limited series, 10 episodes designed to correct the mistakes of the original finale and give the character a proper conclusion. Clyde Phillips, the showrunner who had presided over the show's golden era during seasons 1 through 4, was brought back to oversee the project. Michael C. Hall returned to play Dexter. The production was titled Dexter: New Blood, and it premiered on November 7, 2021. Nearly a decade after the original series had ended with that lumberjack scene that nobody liked. New Blood was set roughly 10 years after the events of the original finale. Dexter was no longer in the Pacific Northwest cutting timber. He had moved to a small town called Iron Lake in upstate New York, where he was living under the alias Jim Lindsay. He worked at a local hunting and fishing supply shop called Fred's Fish and Game, run by the owner's son, Fred Jr. He was in a romantic relationship with Angela Bishop, the chief of the Iron Lake Police Department. And most importantly, he had not killed anyone in approximately 10 years. That last detail was the most significant. For a decade, Dexter Morgan had suppressed the dark passenger. He had lived a quiet, unremarkable life in a small town where nobody knew who he was or what he had done. He hadn't used plastic wrap. He hadn't collected blood slides. He hadn't performed the ritual. By every external measure, it appeared that Dexter had succeeded in doing what everyone, including Dexter himself, had once believed impossible. He had stopped. The show depicted his restraint through small but telling details. When Dexter handled hunting equipment at the store, you could see the muscle memory in his hands. When customers brought in deer for processing, the sight of blood triggered something in his eyes, a flicker of the old hunger, quickly suppressed. He had developed coping mechanisms. When the urge to kill rose in him, he would visualize Deborah, not the ghostly Harry that had guided him for years. Deborah. His dead sister appeared in his mind's eye as a harsh, confrontational presence, nothing like the measured, advisory Harry. Deborah's ghost swore at him, called him out, told him not to do it. She was the voice of consequence rather than the voice of strategy, and her presence suggested that Deborah's death had affected Dexter more profoundly than any other event in his life. But 10 years of suppression ended the moment Harrison showed up. Harrison Morgan was no longer a baby sitting in a pool of blood. He was a teenager, a young man who had traveled across the country to find the father who had abandoned him. Hannah McKay, the woman Dexter had entrusted with Harrison's care, was dead. She had died of cancer at some point during the decade, and Harrison had grown up knowing that his father had faked his own death and disappeared. He didn't know where Dexter was. He didn't know who Dexter really was, but he knew his father was alive and he was determined to find him. Harrison's arrival in Iron Lake destabilized everything Dexter had built. Having his son present forced Dexter to confront questions he had been avoiding for 10 years. What had he passed on? Was Harrison damaged by what happened in the bathtub? Did Harrison carry the same dark passenger? Were the violent tendencies that Dexter exhibited from childhood already present in Harrison, lying dormant, waiting for a trigger? The answer appeared to be yes. Harrison showed signs of violence and darkness that alarmed both the audience and Dexter himself. He injured another student at school in a way that went beyond normal adolescent aggression. He was drawn to discussions of violence and death. He carried an anger that seemed disproportionate to his circumstances. Dexter recognized the symptoms because he had exhibited the same ones as a child. The question was whether Harrison's darkness was the result of genetic inheritance, environmental trauma from the bathtub incident, or some combination of both. Nature versus nurture, the franchise's oldest and most persistent question, had arrived in human form. While Dexter was dealing with Harrison's arrival, the dark passenger was reawakening. And the catalyst was a man named Matt Caldwell. Matt was the son of Kurt Caldwell, a seemingly friendly local businessman who ran a truck stop and was a pillar of the Iron Lake community. Matt was a spoiled, reckless young man who had caused the deaths of several people in a boating accident but had escaped serious punishment due to his father's money and influence. When Matt killed a rare white deer in a protected area, something Dexter witnessed directly, the combination of Matt's arrogance, his escape from accountability, and the trigger of witnessing death broke 10 years of restraint. Dexter killed Matt Caldwell, but this kill was different from the kills of the original series. It was messy, it was impulsive. It was driven more by rage than by the disciplined ritual of the code. Dexter had been out of practice for a decade, and it showed. His movements were less precise, his planning was less careful, his disposal method was improvised rather than rehearsed. The clean, clinical killer of the original series was rusty, and that rust would prove fatal. Kurt Caldwell noticed his son's disappearance and began investigating. What Dexter didn't know, and what the audience discovered over the course of the season, was that Kurt Caldwell was himself a serial killer. Kurt had been kidnapping and murdering young women for 25 years. His method was elaborate and ritualistic in its own way, though completely different from Dexter's approach. Kurt would identify vulnerable women, often runaways, hitchhikers, or travelers passing through Iron Lake. He would approach them with the warmth and generosity that made him a respected community figure. He'd offer them food, shelter, a warm bed. He'd house them briefly in comfortable guest accommodations, giving them a sense of safety and normalcy. And then he would release them into the woods near his property, give them a head start, and hunt them with a high-powered rifle. Kurt treated the murders as sport. The women ran, Kurt pursued. And when the hunt was over, Kurt didn't dispose of the bodies the way Dexter did. He didn't dump them in the ocean or bury them in remote locations. Instead, Kurt embalmed and preserved his victims. He kept their bodies in an underground trophy room beneath his cabin, arranged in glass display cases, posed and maintained as though they were mannequins in a museum. Dozens of women, perfectly preserved, dressed in clean clothes, standing upright in their cases, frozen in the moment of their display. The room was Kurt's private gallery, his collection, his legacy. Among the women in Kurt's trophy room was Molly Park, a true crime podcaster who had come to Iron Lake to investigate the story of missing women in the area. Molly had gotten too close to the truth, and Kurt had eliminated her. Her preserved body stood among the others in the underground chamber, a podcaster who had gone looking for a story about missing women and had become one of the missing women herself. Kurt Caldwell's 25 years of undetected killing illustrated the same theme that the original series had explored through Arthur Mitchell. Small towns, like suburban neighborhoods, provide excellent camouflage for predators. Kurt was a pillar of his community. He employed people. He donated to local causes. He was friendly and approachable. Nobody suspected him because nobody had reason to. The women he killed were transients, people without strong local connections, people whose disappearances were unlikely to generate sustained investigation. Kurt had built his hunting ground with the same strategic thinking that Dexter applied to his own operation in Miami. Choose victims who won't be missed, maintain a public persona that deflects suspicion, and never ever let anyone see what's underneath. The parallel between Kurt and Dexter was deliberate and multi-layered. Both were serial killers hiding in communities that trusted them. Both maintained carefully crafted public personas that concealed private horrors. Both were fathers whose violence affected their children in profound ways. Matt Caldwell's recklessness, his privilege, his disregard for human life, these were not innate qualities. They were the products of growing up with a father who secretly viewed human beings as objects to be hunted and collected. Kurt's parenting, like Harry's, had shaped his child's relationship with violence. The difference was that Harry tried to control Dexter's violence while Kurt simply modeled it. Angela Bishop's investigation of Jim Lindsay began with small inconsistencies, a background check that came back too clean, details of his past that didn't quite add up, a girlfriend's instinct that something about the man she was sleeping with wasn't entirely real. Angela was a careful, methodical investigator, and she followed the trail with the kind of patient diligence that would have made Frank Lundy proud. The breakthrough came when Angela connected Jim Lindsay to the Bay Harbor butcher case. She discovered old files, made connections to Miami, and eventually reached out to Angel Batista, who confirmed that a detective named Dexter Morgan had worked at Miami Metro during the period of the butcher killings, and that questions about Dexter's potential involvement had surfaced before being dismissed. Angela also found evidence linking Dexter to the ketamine he had used to sedate Matt Caldwell before killing him, a detail that connected the Iron Lake case to the methods described in the Bay Harbor butcher files. Angela's investigation was the franchise's clearest example of what would have happened if Doakes had been allowed to complete his investigation in Season 2. A competent, determined detective following the evidence where it led, without personal loyalty or emotional attachment getting in the way. Angela didn't love Dexter the way Deborah did. She was involved with Jim Lindsay, but Jim Lindsay wasn't real. Once she understood that the man she'd been dating was a fabrication, her emotional attachment dissolved, and her professional instincts took over. She was Doakes without the cabin explosion. She was LaGuerta without Deborah's bullet. She was the investigation that Dexter had spent his entire career preventing. The parallel between Kurt and Dexter was deliberate. Both were serial killers hiding in communities that trusted them. Both maintained public personas that concealed private horrors. Both were fathers whose violence affected their children. Matt Caldwell's recklessness and disregard for human life was, in its own way, a product of growing up with a father who secretly viewed people as objects to be collected and displayed. Just as Harrison's potential darkness was a product of Dexter's nature and the trauma Dexter had inadvertently passed down. Dexter eventually discovered Kurt's secret. He found the underground trophy room, he saw the preserved bodies, and he killed Kurt Caldwell, removing a predator who had been terrorizing Iron Lake's most vulnerable residents for decades. In this, at least, the code was honored. Kurt was guilty. Kurt had killed innocent people. Kurt had escaped justice for 25 years. By the code's standards, Kurt was a legitimate target. But the Matt Caldwell kill was the problem. Matt was not the same as Kurt. Matt had caused deaths through negligence and privilege, not through deliberate predation. He was a terrible person by most standards, but he wasn't the type of target the code was designed for. Dexter had killed Matt out of impulse and anger, not out of the methodical verification process the code demanded. And the consequences of that sloppy kill were already building. Angela Bishop, the Iron Lake police chief, and Dexter's girlfriend started putting pieces together. She was a good cop with strong instincts, and small inconsistencies in Jim Lindsay's story began nagging at her. She investigated his background, she discovered anomalies. She eventually connected him to the Bay Harbor butcher case in Miami. She contacted Angel Batista, the Miami Metro detective who had worked alongside Dexter for years without knowing his secret. Batista confirmed that he would come to Iron Lake to help with the investigation. Dexter was arrested. He was placed in the Iron Lake Police Station jail, and for the first time in the franchise's history, he was behind bars as a suspect rather than as an analyst. The walls were closing in. Angela knew who he was. Batista was coming from Miami. The Bay Harbor butcher case was about to be reopened with new evidence pointing at the real killer. Dexter's decades-long escape from consequences was finally reaching its endpoint. And then Dexter did something that proved once and for all that the code was a lie. From his jail cell, Dexter called out to Logan, the kind, decent local deputy who had been nothing but friendly to him. Dexter asked for water. Logan approached the cell, and Dexter attacked him. He reached through the bars, grabbed Logan, and put him in a chokehold. Dexter's stated intention was only to get the keys. He told Logan he didn't want to hurt him, he just needed to escape. But Logan reached for his pistol, he fired a shot that missed, and Dexter, in the struggle, snapped Logan's neck. Logan was dead, an innocent man, a good man, a man who had done nothing wrong except bring a glass of water to a prisoner. Dexter had violated the code in the most fundamental way possible. He had killed someone who was not a killer, someone who had not escaped justice, someone who simply stood between Dexter and freedom. Every justification Dexter had ever offered, every argument about only killing those who deserved it, every claim that the dark passenger was directed at people worse than himself, collapsed in the moment Logan's neck broke. The code was supposed to be the thing that made Dexter different from other serial killers. Without the code, Dexter was just a murderer, and he had just murdered an innocent person to save himself. Dexter fled the station. He called Harrison from Logan's phone and told him to meet at a specific location in the woods. Harrison arrived, and when Harrison saw the blood on Dexter's clothes, he asked whose it was. Dexter tried to deflect. He said he would explain later, but Harrison realized Dexter had called from Logan's phone. Harrison understood immediately what that meant. The confrontation that followed was the emotional climax of the entire franchise. Harrison stood in the snow-covered woods with his father and told him the truth that Dexter had been avoiding his entire life. You killed Logan, he wasn't a bad guy. Dexter tried to justify it, he tried to explain the circumstances, but Harrison was not going to be convinced by the same rationalizations that Dexter had used on himself for decades. Harrison told Dexter to turn himself in. Dexter refused. He asked Harrison to come with him, to run, to start over somewhere new. But Harrison could see what Dexter could not or would not. There was no starting over. There was no escape from what Dexter was. Running would only delay the next Logan, the next innocent person who stood between Dexter and self-preservation. The cycle would continue unless someone stopped it. Dexter realized what was happening. He saw the rifle that Harrison was holding. And he made the most meaningful choice of his life. He didn't run, he didn't fight, he didn't try to disarm his son. He accepted it. In that moment, standing in the snow, facing his own child with blood on his hands and no justification left to hide behind, Dexter finally acknowledged what he was. Not a vigilante, not a hero with a code, a serial killer who had run out of excuses. Harrison shot him. Dexter fell to the ground. His son stood over him. The cycle, the one that began in a shipping container in 1973, when a 3-year-old boy sat in his mother's blood, ended in a forest in New York when that boy's son pulled the trigger. Harrison chose to break the chain. He chose not to become Dexter. He chose to end the dark passenger's bloodline not by running from it, but by confronting it directly and putting it down. The scene mirrored the choice Dexter made in Season 1 when he chose Deborah over Brian. Harrison chose humanity over darkness. He chose the world over his father, and he did it with his eyes open, knowing exactly what he was doing and why. Harrison was not acting out of impulse or rage. He was acting out of clarity. He saw what Dexter was. He understood that Dexter would never stop, and he made the only choice that could prevent more innocent people from dying. Angela Bishop arrived at the station to find Logan dead and Dexter gone. She drove to Kurt Caldwell's cabin, followed Dexter's directions, and discovered the underground trophy room. Dozens of preserved women, including Molly Park, a podcaster who had been investigating missing persons in Iron Lake. Angela called for backup, state troopers, FBI, everything she could muster. Kurt Caldwell's decades of hidden violence were finally exposed. The man Dexter had killed was proven to be exactly what Dexter said he was. But Dexter was gone. Harrison was alone in the woods with his father's body. And the franchise had delivered the ending that the original series had failed to provide. Dexter Morgan was dead, killed by the consequences of his own actions, punished not by the justice system but by the person who had the most right to judge him, his own son. Or so it seemed. Because as fans would discover, the franchise was not quite finished with Dexter Morgan. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. New Blood gave Dexter the ending the original series denied him. But the story's roots ran even deeper than the original series had shown, and a prequel would soon reveal the earliest days of the making of a monster. On July 26, 2024, at San Diego Comic-Con, the network officially announced 2 new Dexter projects. One was a prequel series called Dexter: Original Sin. The other was a sequel series called Dexter: Resurrection. The franchise that many people thought had concluded with Harrison pulling the trigger was expanding in both directions simultaneously, reaching backward into Dexter's past and forward into a future that apparently didn't end in those New York woods after all. We'll get to Resurrection shortly, but first, the prequel. Dexter: Original Sin premiered on December 13th, 2024 on Paramount Plus with Showtime, with subsequent episodes airing weekly through February 16th, 2025. The series consisted of 10 episodes set in 1991 Miami, following a young Dexter Morgan as he transitioned from a medical student to a forensic intern at the Miami Metro Police Department. Patrick Gibson played the young Dexter, Christian Slater played the younger Harry Morgan, and Molly Brown played the younger Deborah Morgan. But the crucial creative decision was bringing back Michael C. Hall to provide the inner monologue voiceover. Hall's voice, the same voice that had narrated 8 seasons of the original series, speaking Dexter's thoughts over a younger actor's performance, created a bridge between past and present that grounded the prequel in the franchise's established identity. The series opened with a sequence that initially confused audiences but would eventually make perfect sense. Dexter Morgan, the adult Dexter, was being rushed into an emergency room after surviving a near-fatal gunshot wound. The medical team fought to revive him, and just as his heart started beating again, the scene shifted to a flashback. The same emergency ward, the same hospital, but decades earlier, Laura Moser giving birth to her son. The parallel was deliberate and immediate. Dexter's life was bookended by emergency rooms, born in one, nearly dying in another. The series was telling us from its very first scene that this story was a circle. The prequel then settled into its primary timeline of 1991, exploring Dexter's teenage years and early adulthood. Young Dexter was struggling to suppress his violent urges. Despite Harry's constant guidance and the strict behavioral framework of the code, Dexter found it increasingly difficult to resist his darker impulses. After graduating high school, Dexter started a medical residency, which Harry hoped would channel Dexter's fascination with anatomy and death into something productive. But the residency only deepened Dexter's obsession. He was surrounded by bodies, by blood, by the mechanics of human mortality. And the exposure fed the dark passenger rather than starving it. The series depicted Dexter's first kill under the code in vivid detail. While Harry was hospitalized following his heart attack, Dexter became suspicious of a nurse named Mary. Her behavior was odd. She cut out obituary notices from the newspaper and kept them in a folder. She exhibited unsettling tendencies around patients. Dexter investigated and discovered that Mary had been administering lethal injections to patients, using potassium nitrate to stop their hearts. She was a serial killer operating inside the hospital, preying on vulnerable people under the guise of caregiving. When Dexter found her folder of obituary clippings, he realized these were her trophies, evidence of her kills, collected and preserved. Harry, from his hospital bed, recognized what Dexter had discovered, and in a moment that crystallized the terrible bargain at the heart of the code, Harry gave Dexter permission to kill Mary. This was the moment the code went from theory to practice. Harry had trained Dexter for this. He had taught him how to subdue a target, how to restrain them, how to leave no evidence. And now, for the first time, he was authorizing an actual kill. Not hypothetically, not in the future. Now, do it. Dexter killed Nurse Mary with the meticulous care that the code demanded. He confronted her. He savored the fear she exhibited when she realized what was happening. He disposed of her body in Alligator Alley, a remote area where the likelihood of discovery was minimal. But he made one mistake. He kept her earrings as a trophy. This was the seed of the blood slide collection that would define Dexter's ritual for decades to come. Even on his very first code kill, Dexter needed to keep something. A physical connection to what he had done. A souvenir. The earrings weren't blood slides, but they served the same psychological function. They were proof that the kill had happened. Evidence that the dark passenger had been fed. The prequel also showed Dexter identifying his second potential target, a man named Ferrer. Ferrer was responsible for the deaths of a mother and son through predatory lending practices that had driven the family to ruin. Dexter picked up on Ferrer's guilt like a shark smelling blood in the water. The prequel was careful to show that Dexter didn't just stumble upon targets randomly, he was drawn to them. He noticed details that other people missed. He read body language, tracked inconsistencies, and felt a pull toward guilty people that operated on something deeper than conscious analysis. The code required verification, but Dexter's instinct for identifying killers was already operating before the verification process began. He sensed them. He recognized something in them that he recognized in himself. And then the code gave him permission to act on that recognition. When Dexter returned home and had a conversation with Harry about what he had done, the scene was one of the prequel's most chilling moments. Dexter admitted that killing Mary felt good. He didn't say it felt necessary or justified or like fulfilling a duty. He said it felt good. Harry, hearing his son describe the pleasure of murder, struggled to maintain composure. He had built the code to prevent exactly this. He had created rules and rituals to contain Dexter's violence, not to give Dexter a context in which he could enjoy it. But the code had a fundamental flaw that Harry was only now beginning to understand. You can redirect violence, you can point it at targets who deserve it. You can wrap it in procedure and ritual and justification. But you can't prevent the person committing the violence from taking pleasure in it. The code controlled who Dexter killed and how he killed them. It could not control how killing made Dexter feel. The prequel also explored the relationship between Harry and Laura Moser through extensive flashback sequences, showing events from Harry's perspective as they built toward the shipping yard massacre. We saw Harry recruiting Laura as an informant. We saw the development of their romantic relationship. We saw Laura's growing terror as she became more deeply embedded in the drug operation. And we saw, in agonizing slow motion, the events that led to her death. These flashback sequences added emotional depth to a backstory that the original series had only sketched in broad strokes. Laura Moser became a fully realized character rather than just a name on a police file. We saw her devotion to her sons, we saw her fear, we saw her asking Harry to let her stop, begging him to find another way. And we saw Harry's refusal, his insistence that they needed to catch Estrada, that this was the only path forward. The prequel made Harry's guilt concrete and specific in a way the original series never did. We didn't just hear about Harry feeling guilty. We watched him make the decisions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And we watched Laura walk into the shipping yard knowing she might not walk out. The prequel series also fleshed out young Deborah Morgan's experience of growing up in the same house as Dexter, unaware of the secret her father and brother shared. Deborah was the odd one out in the Morgan family. She didn't have the bond with Harry that Dexter had, because that bond was built on a secret she wasn't allowed to know. She sensed the exclusion without understanding it. She knew her father and brother had a closeness that she couldn't access. And the frustration and hurt this caused manifested in typical teenage rebellion and a deep-seated need for approval that would define her character for the rest of the franchise. One particularly telling detail in the prequel involved a pair of earrings, the earrings Dexter had taken from Nurse Mary as a trophy. Deborah found them while going through Dexter's room. Not knowing their significance, she took them to a pawn shop and discovered they were fake. In their place, she sold her own pearl necklace, a gift from her mother. It was a small moment, but it captured the dynamic perfectly. Dexter kept trophies of death hidden in plain sight. Deborah, oblivious, stumbled across them and was affected by their presence without understanding why. The lives of the Morgan siblings were intertwined in ways that Deborah couldn't see. and every secret Dexter kept was another thread pulling the fabric of their family tighter toward an eventual rupture. Dexter's first day at the Miami Metro Forensics Department was depicted with a mix of excitement and foreboding. The internship had been offered by Tanya Martin, a forensic expert who was impressed by Dexter's sharp mind and eye for detail during a visit to the Morgan home. Tanya saw Dexter's potential as a scientist and analyst. She had no idea she was recruiting a serial killer into the institution designed to catch serial killers. It was the beginning of Dexter's decades-long embedding within law enforcement, the ultimate camouflage that the code required. Young Dexter at Miami Metro was depicted as awkward, eager, and slightly off, in ways that his colleagues noticed but couldn't quite define. He was teased by the other analysts. He was sent to get coffee when he wanted to examine crime scenes. He didn't understand the rhythms of workplace social interaction in the way that came naturally to others. Harry, who was also working at the station, encouraged Dexter to use humor as a coping mechanism, to mimic the banter that cops use to deal with the psychological toll of their work. It was another lesson in camouflage, another instruction in how to appear human. The prequel series also introduced a significant subplot involving Captain Aaron Spencer, Harry's superior at Miami Metro. Spencer was an older officer with a long history in the department, and as the season progressed, Dexter began to suspect that Spencer was not who he appeared to be. Dexter's instincts, sharpened by the code's requirement to identify killers, detected something wrong in Spencer's behavior. This subplot allowed the prequel to demonstrate the code in its earliest operational phase. Young Dexter identifying a potential target, gathering evidence, building a case according to the rules Harry had established, and ultimately acting on his findings. The season's final episodes brought multiple threads together. The shipping yard massacre was finally depicted in its entirety, from Harry's desperate search for Laura after realizing she had been taken, to the police arriving at the container and finding the boys in the blood. Harry had to put on a police uniform to join the search because Spencer, upon learning about Harry's affair with Laura, had demanded his badge. Harry arrived at the containers and had to listen for signs of life, legally unable to open containers without probable cause. The bureaucratic constraints of the moment, the agonizing wait while a woman was potentially being murdered inside a container that officers couldn't enter without justification, added a layer of institutional horror to an event that was already personally devastating. When Harry finally found Dexter, the scene recreated the iconic image that had been shown in brief flashbacks throughout the original series, but never at full length. Harry in his police uniform holding a blood-covered 3-year-old Dexter against his chest, walking away from the container. The boy's arms wrapped around the detective's neck. The beginning of a bond that would define both of their lives. But Original Sin showed what the original series hadn't. Brian was found too. And Harry saw Brian. He looked at the older boy and made a decision in that moment that would create the ice truck killer. He took Dexter and he left Brian for the other officers. He couldn't save both, or he believed he couldn't, or he chose not to. The reason depended on which version of the story you believed, and the prequel deliberately left the ambiguity intact. Brian Moser appeared throughout Original Sin as a figure watching from the shadows. He had tracked Dexter down years before his campaign as the ice truck killer. He had been observing his younger brother from a distance, watching Dexter grow up, watching Dexter develop under Harry's guidance, watching Dexter begin to kill. Brian was present in Dexter's life long before Dexter knew it, a ghost from the shipping container who had never stopped watching the brother who was saved while he was left behind. The finale of Original Sin brought a sense of bittersweet closure to its particular chapter. Dexter was officially accepted into the Miami Metro Forensics Department as a full-time member. Deborah enrolled in the police academy, beginning her own journey toward law enforcement. Harry expressed pride in Dexter for a specific incident where Dexter had prioritized saving a child's life over pursuing a target. Harry told Dexter that the code now belonged to him. It was no longer just Harry's rules. Dexter had internalized them. He had made them his own. The training was complete. The episode ended with the Morgan family dancing together. Dexter narrated over the scene, reflecting on family and fear, saying that despite everything dark inside him, the one thing that could save him was family. It was a warm ending, a rare moment of uncomplicated happiness in a franchise defined by horror. But the warmth was undercut by two things. First, the audience's knowledge of everything that would follow. The ice truck killer, the Bay Harbor butcher, Rita in the bathtub, Deborah's murder of LaGuerta, Deborah's death. The cycle of destruction that this moment of family happiness was already on its way toward. And second, the shot of Brian watching the family dance from outside the house, alone in the darkness, excluded from the love and connection that could have been his if Harry had made a different choice at the shipping container. Original Sin was canceled in August 2025, despite having been renewed for a second season. The cancellation was surprising given the franchise's continued commercial viability, but it reflected broader shifts in the streaming landscape and corporate decision-making at Paramount. The prequel had served its purpose, filling in the gaps of Dexter's early history and adding texture to relationships and events that the original series had only sketched. Whether it needed to continue beyond one season was debatable. The story it told was complete in itself. The making of a monster, from the blood of the shipping container to the fluorescent lights of the forensics lab. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Original Sin showed us where Dexter began, but the franchise's most surprising twist was still to come, because the bullet Harrison fired in those New York woods didn't land where anyone expected. When Harrison Morgan pulled the trigger in the finale of Dexter, New Blood, the audience understood it as an ending. The son killed the father. The cycle of violence was broken. Dexter Morgan was dead, lying in the snow with his son standing over him, the dark passenger finally extinguished. It was a definitive conclusion, the kind of ending that the original series had failed to deliver. Dexter faced consequences. Dexter paid the price. The story was over, except it wasn't. Because Dexter Resurrection, which premiered on July 11th, 2025 on Paramount Plus with Showtime, revealed that Dexter survived the gunshot. He didn't die in those woods. He was found, rushed to a hospital, and resuscitated in an emergency room. The very first scene of Original Sin, the one that showed Dexter being revived by a medical team after a near-fatal gunshot wound, was not a prologue to the prequel. It was a direct continuation of the New Blood finale. The prequel and the sequel were connected by that single opening image of a man being pulled back from death. This revelation was polarizing. Some fans felt that bringing Dexter back undermined the emotional power of New Blood's ending. Harrison's choice, the culmination of the franchise's decades-long exploration of inherited violence, felt diminished if the person he shot simply survived. Others argued that Resurrection opened new storytelling possibilities, that exploring what Dexter does after losing everything, after being shot by his own son, after being exposed as a serial killer, was potentially more interesting than leaving him dead in the snow. Resurrection was set in New York City. Dexter, having survived his wound and eventually recovered, traveled to the city to find Harrison, the son who had shot him, the son who had tried to end the cycle. Dexter's motivation for seeking out Harrison was complicated by everything that had happened between them. Harrison had tried to kill him. Harrison had rejected everything Dexter was. Harrison had chosen to break the chain of violence rather than perpetuate it. And yet Dexter went looking for him anyway. Whether this was driven by genuine paternal love, by a need to control the narrative around his own exposure, or by the dark passenger's refusal to stay quiet even after a near-death experience, was one of the central questions of the new series. The show introduced significant new cast members. Uma Thurman and Peter Dinklage joined the ensemble, bringing star power and fresh creative energy to a franchise that was now extending into its fifth distinct series. Angel Batista returned as well, the Miami Metro detective who had worked alongside Dexter for years and who had been contacted by Angela Bishop during the events of New Blood. Batista's presence connected the new series to the original in a direct way, bringing the weight of Miami Metro's history into the story. James Remar also returned as Harry Morgan, appearing once again as the spectral projection that had haunted Dexter's mind for decades. The ghost of Harry, the voice of the code, was still present, still advising, still arguing with Dexter about his choices. But the dynamic had shifted. In the original series, Harry's ghost represented the code's authority. He was the conscience Dexter couldn't silence. In Resurrection, after everything that had happened, Harry's presence felt different. Less like guidance and more like a ghost that refused to leave because neither Harry nor Dexter knew how to exist without the other. Resurrection's first season consisted of episodes that aired weekly through September 7th, 2025, and by October 2025, the show had been renewed for a second season. The network announced plans for at least 3 seasons, with the possibility of more depending on audience reception and creative direction. The franchise that began in 2006 was now approaching its 20th anniversary with no sign of slowing down. The series also announced a currently unnamed spin-off prequel focused on the Trinity Killer. This new show would explore the early life and initial murders of Arthur Mitchell in the 1970s, decades before he encountered Dexter in Season 4. The announcement suggested that the franchise was expanding into a broader universe, using the rich gallery of antagonists from the original series as the basis for standalone stories. Arthur Mitchell's origin, the childhood traumas that created his cycle of bathtub, building, and bludgeoning, was fertile ground for the same kind of psychological exploration that had made the original series compelling. The existence of Resurrection raised profound questions about the franchise's relationship with its own themes. For 8 seasons of the original series, the show explored whether Dexter could escape the consequences of his violence. The answer, delivered through the deaths of Doakes, Rita, LaGuerta, and Deborah, was consistently no. The people around Dexter paid the price even when Dexter himself did not. New blood appeared to correct this by having Dexter finally pay the ultimate price himself. Resurrection reversed that correction, bringing Dexter back from death and placing him once again in a world where he had to navigate the fallout of his past while wrestling with the compulsions of his present. The question at the center of Resurrection was whether Dexter could exist in a world that now knew who he was. In the original series, the entire architecture of Dexter's life was built on secrecy. The code's first rule was that he must never be caught. Everything flowed from that: the double life, the public persona, the careful deception of colleagues and loved ones. But now the secret was out. Angela Bishop knew, Angel Batista knew, Harrison knew. The Bay Harbor butcher case was being reconnected to Dexter rather than to Doakes. The foundational premise of the entire franchise, that Dexter operated in secret, was gone. What replaced it was a fundamentally different kind of story. Not a story about whether Dexter would be caught, but a story about what Dexter became after being caught. Not a question of if, but a question of what now. Could Dexter redeem himself? Could he build something meaningful with the son who had shot him? Could he find a way to exist in a world that knew exactly what he was? Or would the dark passenger, the force that had driven him since childhood, prove to be the only constant in a life where everything else had been stripped away? Harrison's arc in Resurrection was equally compelling. He had made the hardest choice of his life in those New York woods. He had shot his father, he had tried to end the cycle, and now his father was alive, searching for him, and Harrison had to decide what that meant. Did he still believe he had done the right thing? Did surviving change the moral calculus of what Dexter deserved? Was Harrison himself still at risk of inheriting the darkness? Or had the act of shooting his father been the catharsis that separated him from Dexter's path? The father-son dynamic in Resurrection echoed the father-son dynamic between Harry and Dexter in the original series, but with crucial differences. Harry had tried to shape Dexter into something manageable. Harrison had tried to destroy what Dexter was. Harry believed that darkness could be controlled. Harrison believed it had to be stopped. Both approaches were born from love, and both carried the risk of failure. Harry's approach failed because the code couldn't prevent Dexter from hurting innocent people. Harrison's approach appeared to have failed because the gunshot didn't kill the thing it was aimed at. The dark passenger survived, and the question was whether any human relationship could withstand the weight of that survival. Resurrection also explored the broader consequences of Dexter's exposure. For decades, James Doakes had borne the label of the Bay Harbor Butcher. His name was attached to dozens of murders he didn't commit. His career, his reputation, his legacy were all defined by a lie. If Dexter was now identified as the real Bay Harbor Butcher, then Doakes' name could finally be cleared. The man who had been right about Dexter from the beginning, who had paid with his life for that rightness, might finally receive the posthumous vindication he deserved. Whether the show would address this debt to Doakes' memory remained to be seen, but the possibility added emotional stakes that extended beyond Dexter himself. Angel Batista's involvement in Resurrection was particularly significant because of what it represented. Batista had sat across from Dexter in the Miami Metro bullpen for years. He had shared meals with Dexter. He had trusted Dexter. He had considered Dexter a friend. And now he was confronting the reality that his friend was a serial killer who had manipulated everyone around him for decades. The betrayal Batista felt was not the same as Deborah's betrayal, which was familial and devastating. Batista's was professional and personal in a different way. He had to look back at every interaction, every case, every moment of trust, and reconsider all of it through the lens of what he now knew. Every time Dexter had helped analyze a crime scene, he had been using his expertise to monitor the investigation's proximity to his own crimes. Every time Dexter had seemed like a good colleague, he had been performing. The franchise's expansion also raised questions about creative sustainability. The original series ran for 8 seasons and showed clear signs of quality decline in its later years. New Blood was a 10-episode limited series that maintained focus and discipline. Original Sin was a 10-episode prequel that served a specific narrative purpose. But Resurrection was planned as a multi-season series with at least 3 installments. Could the franchise sustain its quality over an extended run? Could it find new things to say about a character who had been explored from every conceivable angle? The track record was mixed. Seasons 1 through 4 of the original series are widely considered excellent television. Seasons 5 through 8, with notable exceptions, represented a gradual decline. The franchise's willingness to continue expanding was either a sign of creative confidence or commercial ambition, and only time would tell which. What was clear was that the Dexter universe had become one of the most durable properties in television history. From its premiere in 2006 through its latest installments in 2025, the franchise had maintained a consistent audience and a cultural presence that few shows can match. Dexter Morgan had become one of the most recognizable characters in modern television, standing alongside Walter White, Tony Soprano, and Don Draper as a defining figure of the golden age of anti-hero television. But unlike those characters whose stories ended definitively, Dexter's story kept going. He kept surviving. He kept returning. The dark passenger, it seemed, was as impossible to kill as Dexter himself. The legacy of the franchise extended beyond the screen. Dexter's portrayal of a sympathetic serial killer had sparked ongoing debates about media violence, the ethics of audience identification with criminals, and the ways in which storytelling can normalize extreme behavior. The show had been cited in real-world criminal cases, though the details and legal significance of those citations remained difficult to verify comprehensively. What was undeniable was that Dexter had changed the landscape of what television could depict and how audiences could feel about it. Before Dexter, the idea of spending 8 seasons rooting for an active serial killer seemed absurd. After Dexter, it seemed not only possible but commercially viable. The Parents Television Council had protested when CIES broadcast edited versions of Dexter Season 1 during the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike, arguing that putting a sympathetic serial killer on broadcast television was socially irresponsible. They weren't wrong that Dexter pushed boundaries, but the show's popularity suggested that audiences were hungry for moral complexity, for stories that didn't sort characters into neat categories of good and evil, for narratives that forced viewers to confront their own capacity for empathy with deeply flawed people. Daniel Licht, the composer who had scored the original series, New Blood, and associated projects, had created an eerie, Latin-influenced musical identity that became inseparable from the franchise's atmosphere. Following Licht's passing, Pat Irwin took over composing duties for Resurrection, maintaining the auditory continuity while bringing fresh textures to a new chapter of the story. The main title theme, composed by Rolf Kent, had remained unchanged throughout the original 8-season run. Its macabre imagery of Dexter's morning routine, shaving, making breakfast, tying his shoes, all presented as unsettlingly banal activities performed by a man who dismembers people at night, becoming one of television's most iconic opening sequences. From a production standpoint, the franchise had evolved visually across its iterations. The original series used a saturated, bright visual palette that captured Miami's tropical energy. New Blood shifted to an ultra-wide 21:9 aspect ratio, creating a more cinematic presentation with a colder, more muted color scheme that reflected the rural New York setting. Original Sin used an 18:9 aspect ratio. These technical choices were more than aesthetic preferences. They signaled shifts in tone and ambition, positioning the later series as more cinematic and prestige-oriented than the original. Behind the scenes, Michael C. Hall's commitment to the role had been extraordinary. During the filming of Season 4, Hall was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. He underwent treatment while continuing to work on what many consider the show's finest season. His physical changes were subtly masked by the makeup and wardrobe departments, and Hall delivered what may be his best performance during one of the most challenging periods of his personal life. His willingness to return for New Blood a decade later and to provide voice work for Original Sin demonstrated a dedication to the character that went beyond contractual obligation. The franchise that began with a novel by Jeff Lindsay called Darkly Dreaming Dexter, published in 2004, had grown into a multi-platform entertainment property spanning television series, animated web shorts called Dexter Early Cuts, comic books published by Marvel, and video games. The Dexter franchise also included a comic book crossover titled Dexter vs. Jason vs. Hack //, which brought the character into contact with other horror properties in print media. Lindsay's original novel series ran to 8 books, concluding with Dexter is Dead in 2015. The novels maintained a more pulpy, darkly comedic tone than the television series and eventually introduced supernatural elements regarding the dark passenger that the show deliberately avoided. The television adaptation diverged from the books after Season 1, forging its own path through original storylines that bore little resemblance to Lindsay's later novels. This divergence was one of the franchise's smartest decisions, allowing the show to develop its own voice and pursue character arcs that the book's more genre-heavy approach couldn't accommodate. At one point, Dexter was reportedly the most rented DVD box set in Netflix history, a testament to the show's enduring rewatch appeal and the addictive quality of its premise. The series was later removed from Netflix in the United States in June 2025, with streaming rights consolidating under Paramount Plus with Showtime. During the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike, edited versions of Dexter Season 1 were broadcast on CBS, marking a rare instance of premium cable content airing on free-to-air broadcast television, though the episodes were heavily censored to remove graphic violence and language. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. We've walked through the complete mythology of Dexter Morgan, from the shipping container to the resurrection. Now, as we approach the end of our journey tonight, let's step back and ask what all of this lore actually means. What does the story of Dexter Morgan tell us about violence, trauma, inheritance, and the stories we tell ourselves about the darkness inside us? After spending all this time examining Dexter Morgan through every angle the franchise offers, looking at his origin trauma, his training under the Code of Harry, the Dark Passenger, the parade of antagonists who mirrored and challenged him, the destruction of everyone who loved him, and his survival through death itself, we can step back and ask what Dexter's story reveals about real questions that extend far beyond a television series. Dexter is a fictional character in a crime drama that was sometimes brilliant and sometimes messy. But the questions he embodies are genuine questions that touch on psychology, philosophy, morality, and the nature of human behavior. Understanding what the franchise is saying through Dexter helps us think about things that matter beyond entertainment. The first and most obvious question that the Dexter mythology explores is the question of nature versus nurture. Was Dexter born a killer, or was he made one? The franchise never commits entirely to one answer, and that ambiguity is deliberate. The evidence for nature is strong. Dexter's biological brother, Brian, who experienced the same childhood trauma, also became a serial killer. This suggests a genetic predisposition toward violence that existed in the Moser bloodline, independent of environmental factors. Laura Moser was involved in the drug trade. Joe Driscoll, Dexter's biological father, had a criminal history. The raw material for violence was present before the shipping container, but the evidence for nurture is equally strong. The shipping container trauma was the catalyzing event. Without it, Dexter might have channeled whatever natural tendencies he possessed into something less destructive. Harry's training was an environmental factor that shaped how those tendencies expressed themselves. The code was an imposed behavioral framework, not an innate characteristic. And the crucial difference between Dexter and Brian, the one who received structure and the one who didn't, suggests that environment played at least as significant a role as genetics. Brian became a chaotic, unrestrained killer because nobody gave him rules. Dexter became a disciplined, ritualized killer because Harry gave him a system. Same raw material, different outcomes. That's nurture, not nature. The honest answer, the one the show ultimately supports, is that both factors were necessary and neither was sufficient alone. Dexter needed the genetic predisposition and the traumatic event and the environmental shaping. Remove any one element and you get a different person. If Dexter had been born to different parents, the predisposition might never have been triggered. If the shipping container massacre hadn't happened, the trauma that activated the predisposition would have been absent. If Harry hadn't created the code, the expression of the resulting violence would have been different. Dexter Morgan was a product of biology, trauma, and training working together to create something that none of those factors could have produced independently. This matters beyond the show because the nature versus nurture question applies to all human behavior, not just extreme cases like serial killing. We all carry genetic predispositions, we all experience formative events that shape us. We all develop behavioral patterns based on the environments we grow up in. The question of how responsible we are for who we become, given that so much of who we become was determined by factors we didn't choose, is one of the oldest and most persistent questions in philosophy and psychology. Dexter's story doesn't answer this question definitively, but it illustrates it with a clarity that abstract philosophical arguments often lack. The second major question the franchise explores is whether moral frameworks can be applied to inherently immoral behavior. The Code of Harry is, at its core, a set of ethics for serial killing. It says that certain murders are acceptable and others are not. It creates categories of justified and unjustified violence. It imposes rules, rituals, and verification processes on an act that most moral systems consider absolutely wrong regardless of circumstances. The code is, in effect, a utilitarian argument applied to murder. If Dexter is going to kill anyway, then minimizing the harm by directing his violence at people who deserve it produces a better outcome than letting him kill randomly. The franchise treats this argument with surprising seriousness. For large portions of the series, the code appears to work. Dexter kills genuinely terrible people. He removes murderers, rapists, and predators who have escaped justice. His victims, with rare exceptions, are individuals who have caused immense suffering and would continue causing suffering if left alive. From a purely consequentialist perspective, Dexter's kills might produce more good than harm. The people he kills would have killed again. The people he protects by killing them would have been their next victims. If you're keeping a moral ledger, the math arguably works out. But the franchise also systematically dismantles this argument. Dexter kills Jonathan Farrow, who turns out to be innocent. Dexter kills Logan, who is completely innocent. Dexter's actions lead to the deaths of Doakes, Rita, LaGuerta, and Deborah, none of whom deserved to die. The collateral damage of the code extends far beyond its intended targets, and the code's very existence creates moral hazard. By giving Dexter a framework that justifies his violence, the code removes the psychological deterrent that might otherwise cause him to seek help, restrain himself, or stop entirely. The code makes killing easier, not harder. It's a permission structure dressed up as a restriction. The third question, and perhaps the deepest one, is about the stories we tell ourselves. Dexter's Dark Passenger is a narrative. It's a story he constructed to explain his own behavior in terms that preserved his self-image. I'm not a bad person. There's a bad thing inside me. This framing is not unique to fictional serial killers. We all construct narratives about ourselves that serve similar psychological functions. We all have explanations for our worst behaviors that position those behaviors as products of external forces rather than internal choices. I wasn't myself. Something came over me. I couldn't help it. These are the civilian versions of the Dark Passenger, and they serve the same purpose. They create distance between who we believe ourselves to be and what we actually do. The franchise's most profound statement might be that the Dark Passenger is a universal human experience, not a unique pathology. Everyone has aspects of their behavior that they prefer to externalize, to treat as foreign intruders rather than native residents of their own psychology. Dexter's version is extreme because his behavior is extreme, but the mechanism is the same. He tells himself a story that allows him to keep doing what he does without confronting the full reality of what he is. And the moments when that story breaks down, when Hannah McKay tells him he has a choice, when Harry's ghost says the dark passenger is no more real than he is, are the moments of greatest psychological danger for Dexter, because without the story, there's just him, and just him is a man who kills people because he wants to. The franchise also explores the concept of inherited trauma and how violence reproduces itself across generations. The shipping container massacre created Dexter. Dexter's existence created the circumstances that killed Rita. Rita's death in the bathtub potentially created the same trauma in Harrison that the shipping container had created in Dexter. Harrison's exposure to his father's nature created a crisis of identity that led him to attempt to end the cycle by killing his father. This is not just a narrative device. It's a reflection of how real trauma works. Violence begets violence. Children of abusers are statistically more likely to become abusers. Children exposed to extreme violence are statistically more likely to develop behavioral problems. The cycle that the Dexter franchise depicts in dramatic, heightened terms is a cycle that psychologists and social workers observe in real families every day. What makes the franchise's treatment of inherited trauma interesting is that it doesn't present the cycle as inevitable. Brian Moser inherited the trauma and became a killer. Dexter inherited the trauma and became a different kind of killer. Harrison inherited the trauma and, at least in New Blood, chose to break the cycle. 3 people exposed to related traumas made 3 different choices. The shipping container didn't create a single outcome. It created a range of possibilities, and individual choices within that range determined what each person became. This is an important distinction because it preserves the concept of moral agency even within a framework of recognized trauma. You can acknowledge that someone was damaged by their experiences and still hold them responsible for what they chose to do with that damage. The relationship between Dexter and his family also illuminates something important about how we relate to people we love who are fundamentally flawed. Harry loved Dexter, but his love led him to build a system that enabled serial killing. Rita loved Dexter, but her love blinded her to the signs that something was profoundly wrong with the man she married. Deborah loved Dexter, but her love drove her to murder an innocent woman and eventually contributed to her own death. In every case, love was not enough to prevent harm. In every case, love actually facilitated harm by creating conditions under which Dexter's violence could continue unchecked. This is a pattern that resonates far beyond the show. Families of addicts, families of abusers, families of people with severe mental illness, they all face versions of this dilemma. Loving someone who is destructive means constantly navigating the boundary between support and enablement. When does helping someone become protecting them from the consequences they need to face? When does loyalty become complicity? The Dexter franchise dramatizes these questions in extreme form, but the underlying dynamics are recognizable to anyone who has ever loved someone whose behavior was harmful to themselves and others. The franchise's treatment of justice is also worth examining. Across all of its iterations, the Dexter mythology is deeply skeptical of formal justice systems. The entire premise of the code is that the legal system fails, killers escape punishment, evidence gets suppressed, technicalities let the guilty go free. The code exists because the system doesn't work, and the show provides ample evidence to support this view. Almost every antagonist in the series is someone who has avoided justice through some combination of wealth, corruption, or institutional failure. But the show also demonstrates that Dexter's alternative isn't better. Vigilante justice, even when applied by someone as meticulous and intelligent as Dexter, produces its own failures and injustices. Innocent people die, evidence is destroyed, the wrong conclusions are reached, and the vigilante himself is unaccountable, answerable to no one, operating according to rules he wrote for himself that he can rewrite whenever convenient. The code is not justice. It's one man's opinion about who deserves to die, enforced through physical violence and maintained through deception. That's not a correction of the system's flaws, that's a replacement of one set of flaws with another. The franchise seems to arrive at a bleak but honest conclusion about justice. Formal systems are imperfect. Vigilante alternatives are worse. No mechanism exists that can perfectly sort the guilty from the innocent and administer appropriate consequences every time. The best we can do is build imperfect systems and try to improve them incrementally. Dexter's approach of bypassing the system entirely and implementing his own version of justice through murder is, the show suggests, an appealing fantasy that collapses on contact with reality. It works in the abstract and fails in practice. The concept of masks and performance is another thread that runs through the entire franchise. Dexter performs normalcy. He studied human behavior like a foreign language and learned to mimic it well enough to pass. He observed how people smiled and practiced in the mirror. He watched how colleagues interacted and copied the rhythms. He maintained relationships, held down a job, attended social events, all while feeling or believing he felt nothing genuine underneath the performance. The show's opening credits captured this perfectly. Dexter shaving, making coffee, getting dressed. Ordinary activities performed by an extraordinary predator. The mundane and the monstrous coexisting in the same body, separated by nothing but a performance of normalcy. This idea of performance resonates because, to varying degrees, everyone performs. Social interaction requires a certain amount of masking. We all modulate our behavior based on context. We act differently at work than at home, differently with friends than with strangers, differently in public than in private. Dexter takes this universal human experience and extends it to its logical extreme. If everyone performs, then the question isn't whether you're performing, but how different the performance is from what's underneath it. For Dexter, the gap between mask and reality is enormous. For other people, it's smaller but still present. The franchise uses Dexter's extreme case to illuminate the performance that all of us engage in, and to ask uncomfortable questions about what our own masks are hiding. One of the franchise's most elegant structural choices was the way each season's central antagonist forced Dexter to confront a specific aspect of his own identity. This wasn't accidental. The creators designed each big bad as a thematic mirror that reflected one part of Dexter back at him, forcing him to examine something he had been avoiding. Brian Moser, the ice truck killer, forced Dexter to confront the question of biological identity. Am I defined by my blood or by my choices? By the family I was born into or the family that raised me? By choosing Deborah over Brian, Dexter answered this question in favor of nurture over nature, choosing the life Harry built over the life the shipping container created. Lila West in Season 2, while not the primary antagonist in the traditional sense, forced Dexter to confront whether anyone could truly accept him as he was. Lila saw Dexter's darkness and was drawn to it rather than repelled. She represented the seductive possibility of being fully known and fully accepted. But her acceptance came without the boundaries that the code provided, and the relationship quickly became destructive. Lila showed that acceptance without structure was as dangerous as suppression. Miguel Prado in Season 3 forced Dexter to confront the question of friendship and partnership. Could Dexter share the code with someone else? Could he have an equal rather than always operating alone? The answer was no. Miguel used the code's framework to justify killing people for personal and political reasons, corrupting the system Harry had designed. The experiment in partnership proved that the code worked only when controlled by a single person operating under Harry's specific framework. Shared power led to abuse. Arthur Mitchell forced Dexter to confront the question of family. Could a killer be a father? Could the double life extend to include a wife, children, and domestic normalcy? Arthur showed that it could, technically, but only at the cost of destroying the family from within. The family that Dexter envied was actually a cage, and the cage's inhabitants were prisoners rather than partners. Travis Marshall in Season 6 forced Dexter to confront the question of mental health and hallucination. If Travis was delusional for seeing Geller and following his instructions, was Dexter equally delusional for seeing Harry? The parallel was uncomfortable because it suggested that Dexter's moral guidance system might be as unhinged as a religious zealot's apocalyptic visions. Isaac Serko, the Ukrainian mob figure in Season 7, added another dimension by being a killer whose violence was motivated by love. Isaac was a dangerous, ruthless man who came to Miami seeking vengeance for the murder of his romantic partner. His love was genuine, and his violence was in service of that love. This complicated the franchise's treatment of Dexter's own emotional life because it showed that genuine love and genuine violence could coexist in the same person without the elaborate psychological architecture that Dexter required. And Hannah McKay forced Dexter to confront whether he could love a fellow killer. Hannah was his romantic equal in ways that no other partner had been. She understood him, she shared his capacity for violence. She didn't need the dark passenger explained to her because she had her own version of it. But she also challenged his dependency on the dark passenger concept, telling him directly that he had a choice, that the dark passenger was a convenient fiction rather than a genuine compulsion. Hannah was the partner who saw through Dexter's self-deception more clearly than anyone except perhaps Dr. Wong in that other show. Sorry. What I mean is that Hannah was the partner who came closest to dismantling the narrative infrastructure that allowed Dexter to function. And that made her both his most compatible partner and his most dangerous one. Each of these antagonists stripped away a layer of Dexter's defenses and forced him to look at something he preferred to keep hidden. Taken together, they represent a systematic deconstruction of every aspect of Dexter's identity, a season-by-season dismantling of the persona Harry built, revealing the frightened, traumatized, dangerous man underneath. The franchise also examines what happens when control fails. Dexter's entire life is built around control. The plastic wrap, the ritual, the schedule, the verification process, the disposal method. Every element of his killing is designed to maintain absolute control over an inherently chaotic act. But control is an illusion, and the show demonstrates this repeatedly. Dexter's plans go wrong, his victims fight back, his disposal sites are discovered, his secret is revealed. No matter how meticulous he is, reality is too complex and too unpredictable for any human being to control completely. And when control fails, the consequences are catastrophic. Rita dies because Dexter couldn't control Arthur Mitchell. Deborah dies because Dexter couldn't control the cascade of events his secret set in motion. Every major tragedy in the franchise is a failure of control, a moment where Dexter's carefully constructed systems proved insufficient against the chaos of real life. The lesson extends beyond serial killing. Control is a fundamental human desire, and the pursuit of perfect control is a recipe for suffering. Whether it's controlling a career, a relationship, a body, or a situation, the belief that enough planning and effort can eliminate uncertainty is a trap. Reality is inherently uncertain. Complex systems are inherently unpredictable. And the tighter you try to hold control, the more devastating the loss of control becomes when it inevitably occurs. Dexter's plastic-wrapped kill rooms are the franchise's visual metaphor for the futile attempt to impose perfect order on a world that won't cooperate. The show's treatment of guilt is nuanced and disturbing. Dexter claims not to feel guilt, and for large portions of the series, this appears to be true. He kills without remorse. He disposes of bodies without hesitation. He maintains his double life with apparent ease. But the show also gives us moments that contradict this self-assessment. His anguish over killing Pharaoh, who turned out to be innocent. His devastation after Rita's death. His decision to bury Deborah at sea rather than simply abandoning her body. These moments suggest that guilt, or something very close to it, does exist within Dexter, even if he doesn't label it correctly. The distinction between not feeling guilt and not recognizing guilt is important. Dexter may genuinely not experience guilt in the way that psychologists define it, but he experiences something, call it discomfort, or dissonance, or a sense of wrongness. Whatever it is, it functions like guilt, even if it doesn't carry the same neurological signature. And this raises an interesting question about the relationship between emotion and morality. Is it necessary to feel guilt in the conventional sense in order to recognize that you've done something wrong? Or is it possible to understand wrongness intellectually without experiencing it emotionally? Dexter seems to operate in this gap. He knows rationally that his kills cause pain and that some of them were mistakes, but this knowledge doesn't produce the emotional response that most people would associate with guilt. Whether this makes him more or less culpable is a question the show leaves open. The franchise's exploration of Dexter's drinking and self-medication is worth noting, though it's less prominent than similar themes in other anti-hero shows. Dexter doesn't drink to the same extent as, say, Rick Sanchez or Tony Soprano. But his constant need for stimulation, for the next kill, for the ritual, for the hunt, functions similarly to addiction. The dark passenger is described in terms that mirror addiction language. Cravings, compulsions, tolerance building, the need for escalation. Withdrawal symptoms when the urge is suppressed. The franchise essentially presents serial killing as a behavioral addiction, complete with the same cycles of anticipation, satisfaction, and emptiness that characterize substance abuse. This framing is psychologically accurate in many ways. Violent behavior can become self-reinforcing through the same neurological reward pathways that drive addiction. The rush of adrenaline, the sense of power, the relief of satisfying a compulsion. These are real neurological events that can create dependency patterns. The idea that Dexter might be addicted to killing rather than simply choosing to kill adds another layer of moral complexity to the franchise. If his behavior is driven by addiction, then questions of willpower and choice become more complicated. We don't generally hold addicts to the same moral standards as people making freely chosen decisions, but we also don't excuse the harm that addicts cause simply because their behavior is compulsive rather than deliberate. The franchise navigates this tension without resolving it, presenting Dexter as both a victim of his own neurological wiring and a person who makes choices within the constraints of that wiring. The franchise also has something to say about the concept of legacy. What do you leave behind? What persists after you're gone? Harry left behind the code, a behavioral framework that enabled decades of murder. Rita left behind Harrison, a child born in blood who may or may not have inherited his father's darkness. Deborah left behind the memory of a woman who sacrificed everything for love and was destroyed by that sacrifice. Doakes left behind a false legacy as a serial killer that masked his true legacy as the one honest cop who saw through the deception. And Dexter himself, whose legacy is still being written as the franchise continues, has left behind a trail of destroyed lives, traumatized family members, and a question that refuses to be answered definitively. Was any of it worth it? Did the people Dexter killed under the code represent a net positive, removing genuine threats from the world? Or was the collateral damage so severe that the whole enterprise was a net negative, a system that produced more suffering than it prevented? The franchise's refusal to answer this question is its greatest strength. Lesser shows would have committed to one interpretation. They would have made Dexter a hero whose methods were justified by results, or a villain whose methods were condemned by their consequences. The Dexter franchise does neither. It presents the evidence on both sides and trusts the audience to form their own conclusions. Some viewers watch the entire series and come away believing that Dexter did more good than harm. Others watch the same series and come away believing the opposite. The fact that both interpretations are supportable speaks to the complexity of the storytelling and the genuineness of the moral questions it raises. If there is a single thesis statement that the Dexter franchise advances, it might be this: the stories we tell ourselves about who we are determine what we do, but they don't change who we actually are. Dexter told himself he was a vigilante. He was actually a serial killer. He told himself the dark passenger was an external force. It was actually himself. He told himself the code made him different from other killers. The code was actually a permission structure that enabled him to kill more efficiently. He told himself his family was safe. They were actually in constant danger. Every story Dexter told himself was a lie that allowed him to continue doing what he wanted to do without confronting the full weight of what he was. We do the same thing at a smaller scale in our own lives. We tell ourselves stories about why we do what we do, and those stories are often more comfortable than the truth. The franchise's power comes from its willingness to examine those stories honestly, to peel back the layers of self-deception that allow its protagonist to function, and to show what remains when the stories fall away. What remains is a man sitting in blood, a man in a shipping container, a child who witnessed something unforgivable and spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of it through the only language he knew. Dexter Morgan is not a hero. He's not a villain in the traditional sense. He is a product of terrible circumstances who was shaped by well-intentioned but catastrophically misguided intervention, and who spent his entire life oscillating between the genuine desire to be something better and the inability to escape what he was made. His story is disturbing because it's human, not in its specifics, which are thankfully extreme and fictional, but in its mechanics. The way trauma reproduces itself, the way love enables as much as it protects, the way stories become cages, the way the past refuses to stay past. And that's what makes the lore of Dexter Morgan the kind of thing you can lie awake with at night, turning the pieces over in your mind, following the threads from the shipping container to the bathtub to the snow-covered woods, and finding that every thread connects to every other thread in ways that are as elegant as they are horrifying. The mythology is disturbing not because it depicts violence, though it certainly does, but because it shows how violence works, how it begins, how it spreads, how it's justified, how it's concealed, and how, no matter how carefully it's managed, it always eventually breaks free of whatever constraints are placed upon it. The franchise spans decades of storytelling, 8 seasons of the original series from 2006 to 2013, 10 episodes of New Blood in 2021 and 2022, 10 episodes of Original Sin in 2024 and 2025, Resurrection beginning in 2025 with more seasons planned, a Trinity Killer prequel on the horizon. The universe keeps expanding and the questions keep multiplying. But the core question, the one that was asked in the first episode and has never been definitively answered, remains the same. Can a person who was broken by violence ever be truly fixed? Or is the best we can hope for a kind of managed destruction, a carefully maintained illusion of normalcy that lasts until it doesn't? Harry Morgan believed in management. He built the code because he believed that if you couldn't cure the disease, you could at least control the symptoms. And for a while, it worked. Dexter functioned. He held a job. He maintained relationships. He contributed to society in his own twisted way. But the code was never a cure. It was a tourniquet applied to a wound that never stopped bleeding, and eventually the blood soaked through. It always does. The people who paid the price for Harry's experiment were not the people who designed it. Harry died before the worst consequences arrived. Vogel was killed by her own creation gone wrong. The people who suffered most were the people who had no say in the experiment at all. Rita, who didn't know she was married to a subject in a behavioral study. Deborah, who didn't know her family was built on a foundation of managed psychopathy. Doakes, who didn't know his instincts were leading him into a trap. LaGuerta, who didn't know that doing her job correctly would get her killed. And Harrison, who didn't know that the blood he was born into would follow him for the rest of his life. Tonight's the night. That was Dexter's line, the line he said to himself when the ritual was about to begin. And tonight, for us, the ritual was walking through every layer of this story, from the first drop of blood to the last. I hope the journey was worth taking. I hope some of these ideas follow you as you drift off. And I hope, if nothing else, you walk away understanding why this story has endured for nearly 2 decades, told and retold across 5 different series, dozens of characters, and thousands of pages of script. Because the lore of Dexter Morgan is not just the story of one fictional serial killer. It's a story about what happens when human beings are broken by circumstances they didn't choose and then try to build something livable from the wreckage. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.